which were all republics, and the other two would be certain to send it assistance. These cities stood in a plain, but a few miles apart and in a straight line on the banks of the river. The king had just sat down before the first, vowing that he would knock them down one after the other like a row of ninepins. The carters asked him in return whose retainer he was, and he said that he was on his way to take service, and was under no banner yet. "Then," said the man who had given him a drink, "if you are free like that, you had better join the king's levy, and be careful to avoid the Barons' War. For if you join either of the Barons' War, they will know you to be a stranger, and very likely, if they see that you are quick and active, they will not let you free again. And if you attempt to escape after the campaign, you will find yourself mightily mistaken. The Baron's captain would only have to say you had always been his man, and as for your word, it would be no more than a dog's bark. Besides which, if he rebelled, he would be only to shave off that moustache of yours and declare you a slave. And as you have no friends in camp, a slave you would be." "That would be very unjust," said Felix. "Surely the king would not allow it." "How is he to know?" said one of the carters. "My brother's boy was served just like that. He was born free, the same as all our family, but he was fond of roving, and when he reached Quinton, he was seen by Baron Robert, who was in want of men, and being a likely young fellow, they shaved his lip and forced him to labour under the thong. When his spirit was cowed and he seemed reconciled, they let him grow his moustache again, and there he is now, a retainer and well treated. But still, it was against his will. Jack is right. You had better join the king's levy." The king's levy is composed of his own retainers from his estates of townsmen, who are not retainers of the barons, of any knights and volunteers who like to offer their services, and a king always desires as large a levy as possible, because it enables him to overawe his barons. These, when their war or forces are collected together in a camp, are often troublesome and inclined to usurp authority. A volunteer is, therefore, always welcome in the king's levy. Felix thanked them for the information they had given him, and said he should certainly follow their advice. He could now hardly keep up with the carts, having walked for so many hours and undergone so much previous exertion. Finding this to be the case, he wished them good night, and looked round for some cover. It was now dusk, and he knew he could go no farther. When they understood his intention, they consulted among themselves, and finally made him get up into one of the carts and sit down on the bundles of arrows which filled it like faggots. Thus he was jolted along, the rude wheels fitting but badly on the axle, and often sinking deep into a rut. They were now in a thick forest, and the track was much narrower, so that it had become worn into a hollow, as if it were the dry bed of a torrent. The horses and the carters were weary, yet they were obliged to plod on, as the arms had to be delivered before the morrow. They spoke little, except to urge the animals. Felix soon dropped into a reclining posture. Uneasy as it was a relief, and looking up saw the white summer stars above. After a time he lost consciousness and slept soundly, quite worn out, despite the jolting and creaking of the wheels. The sound of the trumpet woke him with a start. His heavy and dreamless sleep for a moment had taken away his memory, and he did not know where he was. As he sat up, 2 sacks fell from him. The carters had thrown them over him as a protection against the night dew. The summer morning was already as bright as noonday, and the camp about him was astir. In half a minute he came to himself, and getting out of the cart looked around. All his old interest had returned. The spirit of war entered into him. The trumpet sounded again, and the morning breeze extended the many-coloured banners. The spot where he stood was in the rear of the main camp, and but a short distance from the unbroken forest. Upon either hand there was an intermingled mass of stores, carts, and wagons crowded together, sacks and huge heaps of forage, on and about which scores of slave drivers and others were sleeping in every possible attitude, many of them evidently still under the influence of the ale they had drunk the night before. What struck him at once was the absence of any guard here in the rear. The enemy might steal out from the forest behind and help himself to what he chose, or murder the sleeping men, or, passing through the stores, fall on the camp itself. To Felix, this neglect appeared inexplicable. It indicated a mental state which he could not comprehend, a state only to be described by negatives. There was no completeness, no system, no organisation. It was a kind of haphazardness altogether opposite to his own clear and well-ordered ideas. The ground sloped gently downwards from the edge of the forest, and the place where he was had probably been ploughed, but was now trodden flat and hard. Next, in front of the stores, he observed a long, low hut built of poles and roofed with fir branches. The roofs were formed with ferns, straw bundles of hay, anything that had come to hand. On a standard beside it, a pale blue banner with the device of a double hammer worked in gold upon it fluttered in the wind. 20 or 30, perhaps more, spears leant one end against the other of this rude shed, their bright points projecting yards above the roof. To the right of the booth, as many horses were picketed, and not far from them some soldiers were cooking at an open fire of logs. As Felix came slowly towards the booth, winding in and out among the carts and heaps of sacks, he saw that similar erections extended down the slope for a long distance. There were hundreds of them, some large, some small, not placed in any order, but pitched where chance or fancy led, the first comers taking the sites that pleased them, and the rest crowding round. Beside each hut stood the banner of the owner, and Felix knew from this that they were occupied by the barons, knights, and captains of the army. The retainers of each baron bivouacked as they might in the open air. Some of them had hunters' hides, and others used bundles of straw to sleep on. Their fire was as close to their lord's hut as convenient, and thus they were always within call. The servants or slaves also slept in the open air, but in the rear of their owner's booth, and apart from the free retainers, Felix noticed that, although the huts were pitched anyhow and anywhere, those on the lowest ground seemed built along a line, and looking closer, he found that a small stream ran there. He learnt afterwards that there was usually an emulation among the commanders to set up their standards as near the water as possible, on account of the convenience, those in rear having often to lead their horses a long distance to water. Beyond the stream the ground rose again, as gradually as it had declined. It was open and cultivated up to the walls of the besieged city, which was not 3/4 of a mile distant. Felix could not for the moment distinguish the king's headquarters. The confused manner in which the booths were built prevented him from seeing far, though from the higher ground it was easy to look over their low roofs. He now wandered into the centre of the camp, and saw with astonishment groups of retainers everywhere, eating, drinking, talking, and even playing cards or dice, but not a single officer of any rank. At last, stopping by the embers of a fire, he asked timidly if he might have breakfast. The soldiers laughed and pointed to a cart behind them, telling him to help himself. The cart was turned with the tail towards the fire, and laden with bread and sides of bacon, slices of which the retainers had been toasting at the embers. He did as he was bid, and the next minute a soldier not quite steady on his legs even at that hour offered him the can. "For," said he, "you had best drink whilst you may, youngster. There is always plenty of drink and good living at the beginning of a war, and very often not a drop or a bite to be got in the middle of it." Listening to their talk as he ate his breakfast, Felix found the reason there were no officers about was because most of them had drunk too freely the night before. The king himself, they said, was put to bed as tight as a drum, and it took no small quantity to fill so huge a vessel, for he was a remarkably big man. After the fatigue of the recent march, they had in fact refreshed themselves and washed down the dust of the track. They thought that this siege was likely to be a very tough business, and congratulated themselves that it was not 30 miles to Asai, so that so long as they stayed there, they might, perhaps, get supplies of provisions with tolerable regularity. "But if you're over the water, my lad," said the old fellow with the can, picking his teeth with a twig, "and have got to get your victuals by ship, by George, you may have to eat grass or gnaw boughs like a horse." None of these men wore any arms except the inevitable knife. Their arms were piled against the adjacent booth, bows and quivers, spears, sword, bills and darts, thrown together just as they had cast them aside, and more or less rusty from the dew. Felix thought that had the enemy come suddenly down in force, they might have made a clean sweep of the camp, for there were no defences, neither breastwork, nor fosse, nor any set guard. But he forgot that the enemy were quite as ill-organised as the besiegers. Probably they were in still greater confusion, for King Isambard was considered one of the greatest military commanders of his age, if not the very greatest. The only sign of discipline he saw was the careful grooming of some horses, which he rightly guessed to be those ridden by the knights, and the equally careful polishing of pieces of armour before the doors of the huts. He wished now to inquire his way to the king's levee, but as the question rose to his lips, he checked himself, remembering the caution the friendly carters had given him. He therefore determined to walk about the camp till he found some evidence that he was in the immediate neighbourhood of the king. He rose, stood about a little while to allay any possible suspicion. Quite needless precautions, for the soldiers were far too agreeably engaged to take the least notice of him, and then sauntered off with as careless an air as he could assume. Looking about him, first at a forge where the blacksmiths were shoeing a horse, then at a grindstone where a knight's sword was being sharpened, he was nearly knocked down by a horse urged at some speed through the crowds. By a rope from the collar, 3 dead bodies were drawn along the ground, dusty and disfigured by bumping against stone and clod. They were those of slaves, hanged the preceding day, perhaps for pilfering, perhaps for a mere whim, since every baron had power of the gallows. They were dragged through the camp and out a few hundred yards beyond, and there left to the crows. The horrible sight, to which the rest were so accustomed and so indifferent that they did not even turn to look at it, deeply shocked him. The drawn and distorted features, the tongues protruding and literally licking the dust, haunted him for long after. Though his father, as a baron, possessed the same power, it had never been exercised during his tenure of the estate, so that Felix had not been hardened to the sight of executions, common enough elsewhere. Upon the old house estate, a species of negative humanity reigned. If the slaves were not emancipated, they were not hanged, or truly beaten for trifles. Hastening from the spot, Felix came across the artillery, which consisted of battering rams and immense crossbows. The bows were made from entire trees, or more properly poles. He inspected these clumsy contrivances with interest, and entered into conversation with some men who were fitting up the framework on which a battering ram was to swing. Being extremely conceited with themselves and the knowledge that they had acquired from experience only as the repeated blows of the block drive home the pile, they scarcely answered him. But presently, as he lent a hand to assist and bore with their churlishness without reply, they softened and, as usual, asked him to drink, for here and throughout the camp the ale was plentiful, too plentiful for much progress. Felix took the opportunity and suggested a new form of trigger for the unwieldy crossbows. He saw that, as at present discharged, it must require some strength, perhaps the united effort of several men to pull away the bolt or catch. Such an effort must disconcert the aim. These crossbows were worked upon a carriage, and it was difficult to keep the carriage steady even when stakes were inserted by the low wheels. It occurred to him at once that the catch could be depressed by a lever, so that one man could discharge the bow by a mere pressure of the hand, and without interfering with the aim. The men soon understood him, and acknowledged that it would be a great improvement. One, who was the leader of the gang, thought it so valuable an idea that he went off at once to communicate with the lieutenant, who would, in his turn, carry the matter to Baron Ingolf, master of the artillery. The others congratulated him, and asked to share in the reward that would be given to him for this invention. To whose war did he belong? Felix answered, after a little hesitation, to the king's levy. At this they whispered among themselves, and Felix, again remembering the carter's caution, said that he must attend the muster. This was a pure guess, but that he would return directly afterwards, never for a moment suspecting that he would avoid the reward they looked upon as certain. They made no opposition, and he hurried away. Pushing through the groups, and not in the least knowing where he was going, Felix stumbled at last upon the king's quarters. 18. The king's levy. The king's booth stood apart from the rest. It was not much larger, but properly thatched with straw, and the wide doorway hung with purple curtains. Two standards stood beside it, one much higher than the other. The tallest bore the ensign of the kingdom, the lesser the king's own private banner as a knight. A breastwork encircled the booth, enclosing a space about 70 yards in diameter, with a fosse and stakes so planted as to repel assailants. There was but one gateway, opposite the general camp, and this was guarded by soldiers fully armed. A knight on horseback in armour, except his helmet, rode slowly up and down before the gate. He was the officer of the guard. His retainers, some 30 or 40 men, were drawn up close by. A distance of 50 yards intervened between the entrenchment and the camp, and was kept clear. Within the entrenchment, Felix could see a number of gentlemen, and several horses caparisoned, but from the absence of noise and the fact that everyone appeared to walk daintily and on tiptoe, he concluded that the king was still sleeping. The stream ran beside the entrenchment, and between it and the city. The king's quarters were at that corner of the camp highest up the brook, so that the water might not be fouled before it reached him. The king's levy, however, did not seem to be hereabouts, for the booths nearest the headquarters were evidently occupied by great barons, as Felix easily knew from their banners. There was here some little appearance of formality. The soldiery were not so noisy, and there were several officers moving among them. He afterwards discovered that the greater barons claimed the right to camp nearest the king, and that the king's levy was just behind their booths. But, unable to discover the place, and afraid of losing his liberty if he delayed longer, Felix, after hesitating some time, determined to apply direct to the guard at the gate of the circular entrenchment. As he crossed the open ground towards it, he noticed that the king's quarters were the closest to the enemy. Across the little stream were some cornfields, and beyond these the walls of the city, scarcely half a mile distant. There was no outpost. The stream was but a brook and could be crossed with ease. He marvelled at the lack of precaution, but he had yet to learn that the enemy and all the armies of the age were equally ignorant and equally careless. With as humble a demeanour as he could assume, Felix doffed his cap and began to speak to the guard at the gateway of the entrenchment. The nearest man-at-arms immediately raised his spear and struck at him with the butt. The unexpected blow fell on his left shoulder, and with such force as to render it powerless. Before he could utter a remonstrance, a second had seized his boar-spear, snapped the handle across the knee, and hurled the fragments from him. Others then took him by the shoulders and thrust him back across the open space to the camp, where they kicked him and left him bruised and almost stupefied with indignation. His offence was approaching the king's ground with arms in his hands. Later in the afternoon, he found himself sitting on the bank of the stream far below the camp. He had wandered thither without knowing where he was going or what he was doing. His spirit for the time had been crushed, not so much by the physical brutality as by the repulse to his aspirations. Full of high hopes and conscious of great ideas, he had been beaten like a felon hound. From this spot beside the brook, the distant camp appeared very beautiful. The fluttering banners, the green roofs of the booths of ferns and reeds and boughs, the movement and life for bodies of troops were now marching to and fro, and knights in gay attire riding on horseback made a pleasant scene on the sloping ground with the forest at the back. Over the stream the sunshine lit up the walls of the threatened city, where too many flags were waving. Felix came somewhat to himself as he gazed, and presently acknowledged that he had only himself to blame. He had evidently transgressed a rule, and his ignorance of the rule was no excuse, since those who had any right to be in the camp at all were supposed to understand it. He got up, and returning slowly towards the camp, passed on his way the drinking place, where a groom was watering some horses. The man called to him to help hold a spirited charger, and Felix mechanically did as he was asked. The fellow's mates had left him to do their work, and there were too many horses for him to manage. Felix led the charger for him back to the camp, and in return was asked to drink. He preferred food, and a plentiful supply was put before him. The groom, gossiping as he attended to his duties, said that he always welcomed the beginning of a war, for they were often half-starved and had to gnaw the bones like the dogs in peace. But when war was declared, vast quantities of provisions were got together, and everybody gorged at their will. The very dogs battened. He pointed to half a dozen who were tearing a raw shoulder of mutton to pieces. Before the campaign was over, those very few dogs might starve. To what war did Felix belong? He replied to the king's levy. The groom said that this was the king's levy where they were, but under whose command was he? This puzzled Felix. He did not know what to say, and ended up by telling the truth and begging the fellow to advise him, as he feared to lose his liberty. The man said he had better stay where he was, and serve with him under Master Lacy, who was mean enough in the city, but liked to appear liberal when thus consorting with knights and gentlemen. Master Lacy was a merchant of Versailles, an owner of vessels. Like most of his fellows, when war came so close to home, he was almost obliged to join the king's levy. Had he not done so, it would have been recorded against him as a lack of loyalty. His privileges would have been taken from him, possibly the wealth he had accumulated seized, and himself reduced to slavery. Lacy, therefore, put on armour and accompanied the king to the camp. Thus Felix, after all his aspirations, found himself serving as the knave of a mere citizen. He had to take the horses down to water, to scour arms, to fetch wood from the forest for the fire. He was at the beck and call of all the other men who never scrupled to use his services, and, observing that he never refused, put upon him all the more. On the other hand, when there was nothing doing, they were very kind, and even thoughtful. They shared the best with him, brought wine occasionally. Wine was scarce, though ale plentiful, as a delicacy, and one who had dexterously taken a purse presented him with 6 copper coins as his share of the plunder. Felix, grown wiser by experience, did not dare refuse the stolen money. It would have been considered as the greatest insult. He watched his opportunity and threw it away. The men, of course, quickly discovered his superior education, but that did not in the least surprise them, it being extremely common for unfortunate people to descend by degrees to menial offices, if once they left the estate and homestead to which they naturally belonged. There, as cadets, however humble, they were certain of outward respect. Once outside the influence of the head of the house, and they were worse off than the lowest retainer. His fellows would have resented any show of pride, and would speedily have made his life intolerable. As he showed none, they almost petted him, but at the same time expected him to do more than his share of the work. Felix listened with amazement to the revelations to him, of the inner life of the camp and court, the king's weaknesses, his inordinate gluttony and continual intoxication, his fits of temper, his follies and foibles seemed as familiar to these grooms as if they had dwelt with him. As for the courtiers and barons, there was not one whose vices and secrets were not perfectly well known to them. Vice and crime must have their instruments. Instruments are invariably indiscreet, and thus secrets escape. The palace intrigues, the intrigues with other states, the influence of certain women, there was nothing which they did not know. Seen thus from far below, the whole society appeared rotten and corrupted, coarse to the last degree, animated only by the lowest motives. This very gossip seemed in itself criminal to Felix, but he did not at the moment reflect that it was but the tale of servants. Had such language been used by gentlemen, then it would have been treason. As himself of noble birth, Felix had hitherto seen things only from the point of view of his own class. Now he associated with grooms. He began to see society from their point of view, and recognized how feebly it was held together by brute force, intrigue, cord and axe, and women's flattery. But a push seemed needed to overthrow it, yet it was quite secure. Nevertheless, as there was none to give that push, and if any such plot had been formed, those very slaves who suffered the most would have been the very men to give information and to torture the plotters. Felix had never dreamed that common and illiterate men, such as these grooms and retainers, could have any conception of reasons of state or the crafty designs of courts. He now found that, though they could neither write nor read, they had learned the art of reading man, the worst and lowest side of character, to such perfection that they at once detected the motive. They read the face. The very gait and gesture gave them a clue. They read man, in fact, as an animal. They understood men just as they understood the horses and hounds under their charge. Every mood and vicious indication in those animals was known to them, and so too with their masters. Felix thought that he was himself a hunter and understood woodcraft. He now found how mistaken he had been. He had acquired woodcraft as a gentleman. He now learned the knave's woodcraft. They taught him 100 tricks of which he had had no idea. They stripped man of his dignity and nature of her refinement. Everything had a blackguard side to them. He began to understand that high principles and abstract theories were only words with the mass of men. One day he saw a knight coolly trip up a citizen, one of the king's levy, in the midst of the camp and in broad daylight, and quietly cut away his purse, at least a score of persons looking on. But they were only retainers and slaves. There was no one whose word would for a moment have been received against the knights, who had observed this and plundered the citizen with impunity. He flung the lesser coins to the crowd, keeping the gold and silver for himself, and walked off amid their plaudits. Felix saw a slave nailed to a tree, his arms put round it so as to clasp it, and then nails driven through them. There he was left in his agony to perish. No one knew what his fault had been. His master had simply taken a dislike to him. A guard was set that no one should relieve the miserable being. Felix's horror and indignation could not have been expressed, but he was totally helpless. His own condition of mind during this time was such as could not well be analysed. He did not himself understand whether his spirit had been broken, whether he was really degraded with the men with whom he lived, or why he remained with them, though there were moments when it dawned upon him that this education, rude as it was not without its value to him. He need not practise these evils, but it was well to know of their existence. Thus he remained, as it were, quiescent, and the days passed on. He really had not much to do, although the rest put their burdens upon him, for discipline was so lax that the loosest attendants answered equally well with the most conscientious. The one thing all the men about him seemed to think of was the satisfying of their appetites. The one thing they rejoiced at was the fine dry weather, for, as his mates told him, the misery of camp life in rain was almost unendurable. 19. Fighting. Twice Felix saw the king. Once there was a review of the horse outside the camp, and Felix, having to attend with his master's third charger, a mere show and affectation, for there was not the least chance of his needing it, was now and then very near the monarch. For that day at least he looked every whit what Frame had reported him to be, a man of unusual size. His bulk rendered him conspicuous in the front of the throng. His massive head seemed to accord well with the possession of the despotic power. The brow was a little bare, for he was no longer young, but the back of his head was covered with thick ringlets of brown hair, so thick as to partly conceal the coronet of gold which he wore. A short purple cloak, scarcely reaching to the waist, was thrown back off his shoulders, so that his steel corselet glistened in the sun. It was the only armour he had on. A long sword hung at his side. He rode a powerful black horse, full 18 hands high, by far the finest animal on the ground. He required it, for his weight must have been great. Felix passed near enough to note that his eyes were brown, and the expression of his face open, frank, and pleasing. The impression left upon the observer was that of a strong intellect, but a still stronger physique, which latter too often ran away with and controlled the former. No one could look upon him without admiration, and it was difficult to think that he could so demean himself as to wallow in the grossest indulgence. As for the review, though it was a brilliant scene, Felix could not conceal from himself that these gallant knights were extremely irregular in their movements, and not one single evolution was performed correctly, because they were continually quarrelling about precedence, and one would not consent to follow the other. He soon understood, however, that discipline was not the object, nor regularity considered, Personal courage and personal dexterity were everything. This review was the prelude to active operations, and Felix now hoped to have some practical lessons in warfare. He was mistaken. Instead of a grand assault or a regular approach, the fighting was merely a series of combats between small detachments and bodies of the enemy. 2 or 3 knights with their retainers and slaves would start forth, cross the stream, and, riding right past the besieged city, endeavour to sack some small hamlet or the homestead of a noble. From the city, a sortie would ensue. Sometimes the 2 bodies only threatened each other at a distance, the first retiring as the second advanced. Sometimes only a few arrows were discharged. Occasionally they came to blows, but the casualties were rarely heavy. One such party, while returning, was followed by a squadron of horsemen from the town towards the stream, to within 300 yards of the king's quarters. Incensed at this assurance, several knights mounted their horses and rode out to reinforce the returning detachment, which was loaded with booty. Finding themselves about to be supported, they threw down their spoils, faced about, and Felix saw for the first time a real and desperate melee. It was over in 5 minutes. The king's knights, far better horsed and filled with desire to exhibit their valour to the camp, charged with such fury that they overthrew the enemy and rode over him. Felix saw the troops meet. There was a crash and cracking as the lances broke. 4 or 5 rolled from the saddle on the trodden corn, and the next moment the entangled mass of men and horses unwound itself as the enemy hastened back to the walls. Felix was eager to join in such an affray, but he had no horse nor weapon. Upon another occasion, early one bright morning, 4 knights and their followers, about 40 in all, deliberately set out from camp and advanced up the sloping ground towards the city. The camp was soon astir, watching their proceedings, and the king, being made acquainted with what was going on, came out from his booth. Felix, who now entered the circular entrenchment without any difficulty, got up on the mound with scores of others, where, holding to the stakes, they had a good view. The king stood on a bench and watched the troops advance, shading his eyes with his hand. As it was but half a mile to the walls, they could see all that took place. When the knights had got within 200 yards and arrows began to drop amongst them, they dismounted from their horses and left them in charge of the grooms, who walked them up and down, none remaining still a minute, so as to escape the aim of the enemy's archers. Then, drawing their swords, the knights, who were in full armour, put themselves at the head of the band, and advanced at a steady pace to the wall. In their mail, with their shields before them, they cared not for such feeble archery, nor even for the darts that poured upon them when they came within reach. There was no fosse to the wall, so that, pushing forward, they were soon at the foot. So easily had they reached it that Felix almost thought the city already won. Now he saw blocks of stone, darts, and beams of wood cast at them from the parapet, which was not more than 12 feet above the ground. Quite undismayed, the knights set up their ladders, of which they had but 4, 1 each. The men-at-arms held these by main force against the wall, the besiegers trying to throw them away and chopping at the rungs with their axes. But the ladders were well shod with iron to resist such blows, and in a moment Felix saw with intense delight and admiration the 4 knights slowly mount to the parapet and cut at the defenders with their swords. The gleam of steel was distinctly visible as the blades rose and fell. The enemy thrust at them with pikes, but seemed to shrink from closer combat, and a moment afterwards the gallant 4 stood on the top of the wall. Their figures, clad in mail and shield in hand, were distinctly seen against the sky. Up swarmed the men-at-arms behind them, and some seemed to descend on the other side. A shout rose from the camp and echoed over the woods. Felix shouted with the rest, wild with excitement. The next minute While yet the knights stood on the walls and scarcely seemed to know what to do next, there appeared at least a dozen men in armour running along the wall towards them. Felix afterwards understood that the ease with which the four men won the wall at first was owing to there being no men of knightly rank among the defenders at that early hour. Those who had collected to repulse the assault were citizens, retainers, slaves, any, in fact, who had been near. But now the news had reached the enemy's leaders, and some of them hastened to the wall. As these were seen approaching, the camp was hushed, and every eye strained on the combatants. The noble four could not all meet their assailants. The wall was but wide enough for two to fight, but the other two had work enough the next minute, as 8 or 10 more men in mail advanced the other way. So they fought back to back, 2 facing one way and 2 the other. The swords rose and fell. Felix saw a flash of light fly up into the air. It was the point of a sword broken off short. At the foot of the wall, the men who had not had time to mount endeavoured to assist their masters by stabbing upwards with their spears. All at once, 2 of the knights were hurled from the wall. One seemed to be caught by his men. The other came heavily to the ground. While they were fighting, their immediate antagonists, others within the wall, had come with lances and literally thrust them from the parapet. The other 2 still fought back to back for a moment. Then, finding themselves overwhelmed, they sprang down among their friends. The minute the 2 first fell, the grooms with horses ran towards the wall, and despite the rain of arrows, darts, and stones from the parapet, Felix saw with relief 3 of the 4 knights placed on their chargers. Only 1 could sit upright unassisted. 2 were supported in their saddles, and the 4th was carried by his retainers. Thus they retreated, and apparently without further hurt, for the enemy on the wall crowded so much together as to interfere with the aim of their darts, which too soon fell short. But there was a dark heap beneath the wall, where 10 or 12 retainers and slaves who wore no armour had been slain or disabled. Upon these the loss invariably fell. None attempted to follow the retreating party, who slowly returned towards the camp and were soon apparently in safety. But suddenly a fresh party appeared upon the wall, and the instant afterwards 3 retainers dropped as if struck by lightning. They had been hit by a sling stone, whirled with great force by practised slingers. These rounded pebbles come with such impetus as to stun a man at 200 yards. The aim, it is true, is uncertain, but where there is a body of troops, they are sure to strike someone. Hastening on, leaving the 3 fallen men where they lay, the rest in 2 minutes were out of range and came safely into camp. Everyone, as they crossed the stream, ran to meet them, the king included, and as he passed in the throng, Felix heard him remark that they had a capital main of cocks that morning. Of the knights, only one was much injured. He had fallen upon a stone, and 2 ribs were broken. The rest suffered from severe bruises, but had no wound. 6 men-at-arms were missing, probably prisoners, for, as courageous as their masters, they had leapt down from the wall into the town. 11 other retainers or slaves were slain, or had deserted, or were prisoners, and no trouble was taken about them. As for the 3 who were knocked over by the sling-stones, there they lay till they recovered their senses, when they crawled into camp. This incident cooled Felix's ardour for the fray, for he reflected that if injured thus, he too, as a mere groom, would be left. The devotion of the retainers to save and succour their masters was almost heroic. The mailed knights thought no more of their men unless it was some particular favourite than of a hound slashed by a boar's tusk in the chase. When the first flush of his excitement had passed, Felix, thinking over the scene of the morning as he took his horse down to water at the stream, became filled at first with contempt and then with indignation. That the first commander of the age should thus look on while the wall was won before his eyes, and yet never send a strong detachment or move himself with his whole army to follow up the advantage, seemed past understanding. If he did not intend to follow it up, why permit such desperate ventures, which must be overwhelmed by mere numbers and could result only in the loss of brave men? And if he did permit it, why did he not, when he saw they were overthrown, send a squadron to cover their retreat? Call such an exhibition of courage a main of cocks, to look on it as a mere display for his amusement, was barbarous and cruel in the extreme. He worked himself up into a state of anger, which rendered him less cautious than usual in expressing his opinions. The king was not nearly so much at fault as Felix arguing on abstract principles imagined. He had had long experience of war, and he knew its extreme uncertainty. The issue of the greatest battle often hung on the conduct of a single leader, or even a single man-at-arms. He had seen walls won and lost before. To follow up such a venture with a strong detachment must result in one of two things. Either the detachment in its turn must be supported by the entire army, or it must eventually retreat. If it retreated, the loss of prestige would be serious and might encourage the enemy to attack the camp, for it was only his prestige which prevented them. If supported by the entire army, then the fate of the whole expedition depended upon that single day. The enemy had the advantage of the wall, of the narrow streets and enclosures within, of the houses, each of which would become a fortress, and thus, in the winding streets, a repulse might easily happen. To risk such an event would be folly in the last degree, before the town had been dispirited and discouraged by the continuance of the siege, the failure of their provisions, or the fall of their chief leaders in the daily combats that took place. The army had no discipline whatever beyond that of the attachment of the retainer to his lord, and the dread of punishment on the part of the slave. There were no distinct ranks, no organised corps. The knights followed the greater barons, the retainers the knights, and the greater barons followed the king. Such an army could not be risked in an assault of this kind. The venture was not ordered, nor was it discouraged. To discourage, indeed, all attempts would have been bad policy. It was upon the courage and bravery of his knights that the king depended, and upon that alone rested his hopes of victory. The great baron, whose standard they followed, would have sent them assistance if he had deemed it necessary. The king, unless on the day of battle, would not trouble about such detail. As for the remark that they had had a good main of cocks that morning, he simply expressed the feeling of the whole camp. The spectacle Felix had seen was, in fact, merely an instance of the strength and of the weaknesses of the army and the monarch himself. Felix afterwards acknowledged these things to himself, but at the moment, full of admiration for the bravery of the four knights and their followers, he was full of indignation and uttered his views too freely. His fellow grooms cautioned him, but his spirit was up, and he gave way to his feelings without restraint. Now to laugh at the king's weaknesses, his gluttony or follies, was one thing. To criticise his military conduct was another. The one was mere badinage, and the king himself might have laughed had he heard it. The other was treason, and, moreover, likely to touch the monarch on the delicate matter of military reputation. Of this Felix quickly became aware. His mates indeed tried to shield him, but possibly the citizen, his master, had enemies in the camp, barons perhaps to whom he had lent money, and who had watched for a chance of securing his downfall. At all events, early the next day, Felix was rudely arrested by the provost in person, bound with cords, and placed in the provost's booth. At the same time, his master was ordered to remain within, and a guard was put over him. 20. In danger. Hope died within Felix when he thus suddenly found himself so near the executioner. He had known so many butchered without cause that he had indeed reason to despair. Towards the sunset, he felt sure he should be dragged forth and hanged on the oak used for the purpose, and which stood near where the track from a side joined the camp. Such would most probably have been his fate had he been alone concerned in this affair, but by good fortune he was to escape so miserable an end. Still, he suffered as much as if the rope had finished him, for he had no means of knowing what would be the result. His heart swelled with bitterness. He was filled with inexpressible indignation. His whole being rebelled against the blundering, as it were, of events which had thus thrown him into the jaws of death. In an hour or two, however, he sufficiently recovered from the shock to reflect that most probably they would give him some chance to speak for himself. There would not be any trial. Who would waste time in trying so insignificant a wretch? But there might be some opportunity of speaking, and he resolved to use it to the utmost possible extent. He would arraign the unskilful generalship of the king. He would not only point out his errors, but how the enemy could be defeated. He would prove that he had had ideas and plans worthy of attention. He would, as it were, vindicate himself before he was executed, and he tried to collect his thoughts and to put them into form. Every moment the face of Aurora seemed to look upon him, lovingly and mournfully. But beside it he saw the dusty and distorted features of the corpses he had seen drawn by the horse through the camp. Thus, too, his tongue would protrude and lick the dust. He endured, in a word, those treble agonies which the highly wrought and imaginative inflict upon themselves. The hours passed, and still no one came near him. He called, and the guard appeared at the door, but only to see what was the matter, and finding his prisoner safe, at once resumed his walk to and fro. The soldier did not, for his own sake, dare to enter into conversation with a prisoner under arrest for such an offence. He might be involved or suspected. Had it been merely theft or any ordinary crime, he would have talked freely enough and sympathized with his prisoner. As time went on, Felix grew thirsty, but his request for water was disregarded, and there he remained till 4 in the afternoon. Then they marched him out. He begged to be allowed to speak, but the soldiery did not reply, simply hurrying him forward. He now feared that he should be executed without the chance being afforded him to say a word. But to his surprise, he found in a few minutes that they were taking him in the direction of the king's quarters. New fears now seized him, for he had heard of men being turned loose, made to run for their lives, and hunted down with hounds for the amusement of the court. If the citizen's wealth had made him many enemies, men whom he had befriended, and who hoped, if they could but see him executed, to escape the payment of their debts, on the other hand, it had made him as many friends, that is, interested friends, who trusted by doing him great service to obtain advances. These latter had lost no time, for greed is quite as eager as hate, and carried the matter at once to the king. What they desired was that the case should be decided by the monarch himself, and not by his chancellor or a judge appointed for the purpose. The judge would be nearly certain to condemn the citizen and to confiscate whatever he could lay hands on. The king might pardon, and would be content with a part only where his ministers would grasp all. These friends succeeded in their object. The king, who hated all judicial affairs because they involved the trouble of investigation, shrugged his shoulders at the request, and would not have granted it had it not come out that the citizen's servant had declared him to be an incapable commander. At this, The king started. "We are indeed fallen low," said he, "when a miserable trader's knave calls us incapable. We will see this impudent rascal." He accordingly ordered that the prisoner should be brought before him after dinner. Felix was led into the entrenchment, unbound, and commanded to stand upright. There was a considerable assembly of the greater barons anxious to see the trial of the moneylender, who, though present, was kept apart from Felix, lest the two should arrange their defence. The king was sleeping on a couch outside the booth in the shade. He was lying on his back, breathing loudly with open mouth. How different his appearance to the time when he sat on his splendid charger and reviewed his knights. A heavy meal had been succeeded by as heavy a slumber. No one dared to disturb him. The assembly moved on tiptoe and conversed in whispers. The experience divined that the prisoners were certain to be condemned, for the king would wake with indigestion and vent his uneasy sensations upon them. Full an hour elapsed before the king awoke, and called for a draught of water. How Felix envied that draught! He had neither eaten nor drunk since the night previous. It was a hot day, and his tongue was dry and parched. He had never even spoken to him. If the knave told the truth, he must acknowledge this. "How now?" said the king, turning to Felix. "What do you say?" "It is true," replied Felix. "He has never spoken to me, nor I to him. He knew nothing of what I said. I said it on my own account, and I say it again." "And pray, sir knave," said the king, sitting up on his couch, for he was surprised to hear one so meanly dressed speak so correctly, and so boldly face him. "What was it you did say?" "If your majesty will order me a single drop of water," said the prisoner, "I will repeat it word for word." "But I have had nothing the whole day, and I can hardly move my tongue." Without a word, the king handed him the cup from which he had himself drunk. Never, surely, was water so delicious. Felix drained it to the bottom, handed it back. An officer took it, and with one brief thought of Aurora, he said, "Your Majesty, you are an incapable commander." "Go on," said the king sarcastically. "Why am I incapable?" "You have attacked the wrong city. These three are all your enemies, and you have attacked the first. They stand in a row." "They stand in a row?" repeated the king. "And we will knock them over like 3 ninepins." "But you have begun with the end one," said Felix, "and that is the mistake. For after you have taken the first, you must take the second, and still after that the third. But you might have saved much trouble and time if—" "If what?" "If you had assaulted the middle one first. For then, while the siege went on, you would have been able to prevent either of the other 2 towns from sending assistance. And when you had taken the first and put your garrison in it, neither of the others could have stirred or reaped their corn, nor could they even communicate with each other, since you would be between them, and in fact you would have cut your enemies in twain." "By Sir John," swore the king, "it is a good idea, I begin to think. But go on, you have more to say." "I think too, your majesty, that by staying here as you have done this fortnight past, without action, you have encouraged the other 2 cities to make more desperate resistance, and it seems to me that you are in a dangerous position, and maybe at any moment be overwhelmed with disaster, for there is nothing whatever to prevent either of the other 2 from sending troops to burn the open city of Versailles in your absence. And that danger must increase every day as they take courage by your idleness." "Idleness?"
There shall be idleness no longer. The man speaks the truth. We will consider further of this. We will move on to Adlinton.
Turning to his barons. If it please your majesty, said Baron Ingulf, this man invented a new trigger for our carriage crossbows, but he was lost in the crowd, and we have sought for him in vain. My sergeant here has this moment recognised him.
Why did you not come to us before, fellow? Said the king. Let him be released. Let him be entertained at our expense. Give him clothes and a sword. We will see you further.
Overjoyed at this sudden turn of fortune, Felix forgot to let well alone. He had his audience with him for a moment. He could not resist, as it were, following up his victory. He thanked the king, and added that he could make a machine which would knock the walls yonder to pieces without it being necessary to approach nearer than half a bowshot.
What is this? Said the king. Ingulf, have you ever heard of such a machine?
There is no such thing, said the baron, beginning to feel that his professional reputation as the master of the artillery was assailed. There is nothing of the kind known. It will shoot stones as big, as heavy as a man can lift, said Felix, eagerly, and knock 2 towers to fragments. The king looked from one to another. He was incredulous. The baron smiled scornfully. Ask him, your majesty, how these stones are to be thrown. No bow could do it.
How are the stones to be thrown? Said the king sharply. Beware how you play with us.
By the force of twisted ropes, your majesty. They all laughed. The baron said, You see, your majesty, there is nothing of the kind. This is some jester. Twisted ropes should be a halter, said another courier, one of those who'd hoped for the rich man's downfall. It can be done, your majesty, cried Felix, alarmed. I assure you, a stone of 200 weight might be thrown 1/4 of a mile. The assembly did not repress its contempt. The man is a fool, said the king, who now thought that Felix was a jester who had put a trick upon him. But your joke is out of joint. I will teach such fellows to try tricks on us. Beat him out of camp. The provost men seized him, and in a moment he was dragged off his feet and bodily carried outside the entrenchment. Thence they pushed him along, beating him with the butts of their spears to make him run the faster. The groups they passed laughed and jeered. The dogs barked and snapped at his ankles. They hurried him outside the camp and, thrusting him savagely with their spear butts, sent him headlong. There they left him, with the caution which he did not hear, being insensible that if he ventured inside the lines he would be at once hanged. Like a dead dog they left him on the ground. Some hours later, in the dusk of the evening, Felix stole from the spot, skirting the forest like a wild animal, afraid to venture from its cover till it reached the track which led to Assai. His one idea was to reach his canoe. He would have gone through the woods, but that was not possible. Without axe or wood knife to hew away the tangled brushwood, he knew to be impassable, having observed how thick it was when coming. Aching and trembling in every limb, not so much with physical suffering as that kind of inward fever which follows on merited injury, the revolt of the mind against it, he followed the track as fast as his weary frame would let him. He had tasted nothing that day but the draught from the king's cup, and a second draught when he recovered consciousness from the stream that flowed past the camp. Yet he walked steadily on without pause. His head hung forward, and his arms were listless, but his feet mechanically plodded on. He walked, indeed, by his will, and not with his sinews. Thus, like a ghost, for there was no life in him, he traversed the shadowy forest. The dawn came, and still he kept onwards. As the sun rose higher, having now travelled fully 20 miles, he saw houses on the right of the trail. They were evidently those of retainers or workmen employed on the manor, for a castle stood at some distance. An hour later he approached the second or open city of Assai, where the ferry was across the channel. In his present condition, he could not pass through the town. No one there knew of his disgrace, but it was the same to him as if they had. Avoiding the town itself, he crossed the cultivated fields, and upon arriving at the channel at once stepped in and swam across to the opposite shore. It was not more than 60 yards, but, weary as he was, it was an exhausting effort. He sat down, but immediately got up and struggled on. The church tower on the slope of the hill was a landmark by which he easily discovered the direction of the spot where he had hidden the canoe, but he felt unable to push through the belt of brushwood reeds and flags beside the shore, and therefore struck through the firs, following a cattle track which doubtless led to another grazing ground. This ran parallel with the shore, and when he judged himself about level with the canoe, he left it and entered the wood itself. For a little way he could walk, but the thick fir branches soon blocked his progress, and he could proceed only on hands and knees, creeping beneath them. There was a hollow space under the lower branches, free from brushwood. Thus he painfully approached the lake, and descending the hill after an hour's weary work, emerged among the rushes and reeds. He was within 200 yards of the canoe, for he recognised the island opposite it. In 10 minutes he found it undisturbed and exactly as he had left it, except that the breeze had strewn the dry reeds with which it was covered with willow leaves, yellow and dead. They fall while all the rest are green, which had been whirled from the branches. Throwing himself upon the reeds beside the canoe, he dropped asleep as if he had been dead. He awoke as the sun was sinking and sat up, hungry in the extreme, but much refreshed. There were still some stores in the canoe, of which he ate ravenously, but he felt better now. He felt at home beside his boat. He could hardly believe in the reality of the hideous dream through which he had passed. But when he tried to stand, his feet cut and blistered only too painfully assured him of its reality. He took out his hunter's hide and cloak and spread himself a comfortable bed. Though he had slept so long, he was still weary. He reclined in a semi-conscious state, his frame slowly recovering from the strain it had endured, till by degrees he fell asleep again. Sleep, nothing but sleep, restores the overtaxed mind and body. 21. A Voyage. The sun was up when Felix awoke, and as he raised himself, the beauty of the lake before him filled him with pleasure. By the shore it was so calm that the trees were perfectly reflected, and the few willow leaves that had fallen floated without drifting one way or the other. Farther out the islands were lit up with the sunlight, and the swallows skimmed the water, following the outline of their shores. In the lake beyond them, glimpses or which he could see through the channel or passage between, there was a ripple where the faint southwestern breeze touched the surface. His mind went out to the beauty of it. He did not question or analyse his feelings. He launched his vessel and left that hard and tyrannical land for the loveliness of the water. Padding out to the islands, he passed through between them and reached the open lake. There he hoisted the sail. The gentle breeze filled it. The sharp cutwater began to divide the ripples. A bubbling sound arose, and steering due north, straight out to the open and boundless expanse, he was carried swiftly away. The mallards, who saw the canoe coming, at first scarcely moved, never thinking that a boat would venture outside the islands, within whose line they were accustomed to sea vessels. But when the canoe continued to bear down upon them, they flew up and descended far away to one side. When he had sailed past the spot where these birds had floated, the lake was his own. By the shores of the islands the crows came down for mussels. Moorhens swam in and out among the rushes. Water rats nibbled at the flags. Pikes basked at the edge of the weeds. Summer snipes ran along the sound, and doubtless an otter here and there was in concealment. Without the line of the shoals and islets, Now that the mallards had flown, there was a solitude of water. It was far too deep for the longest weeds. Nothing seemed to exist here. The very water snails seek the shore, or are drifted by the currents into shallow corners. Neither great nor little care for the broad expanse. The canoe moved more rapidly as the wind came now with its full force over the distant woods and hills, and though it was but a light southerly breeze, the broad sail impelled the taper vessel swiftly. Reclining in the stern, Felix lost all consciousness of aught but that he was pleasantly borne along. His eyes were not closed, and he was aware of the canoe, the lake, the sunshine, and the sky, and yet he was asleep. Physically awake, he mentally slumbered. It was rest. After the misery, exertion, and excitement of the last fortnight, it was rest, intense rest for body and mind. Pressure of the water against the handle of the rudder paddle, the slight vibration of the wood as the bubbles rushed by beneath, alone, perhaps, kept him from really falling asleep. There was something which could not be left to itself. It must be firmly grasped, and that effort restrained his drowsiness. 3 hours passed. The shore was 12 or 15 miles behind, and looked like a blue cloud, for the summer haze hid the hills more than would have been the case in clearer weather. Another hour, and at last Felix, awakening from his slumberous condition, looked round and saw nothing but the waves. The shore he had left had entirely disappeared, gone down. If there were land more lofty on either hand, the haze concealed it. He looked again. He could scarcely comprehend it. He knew the lake was very wide, but it had never occurred to him that he might possibly sail out of sight of land. This, then, was why the mariners would not quit the islands. They feared the open water. He stood up and swept the horizon carefully, shading his eyes with his hand. There was nothing but a mist at the horizon. He was alone with the sun, the sky, and the lake. He could not surely have sailed into the ocean without knowing it. He sat down, dipped his hand overboard, and tasted the drops that adhered. The water was pure and sweet, warm from the summer sunshine. There was not so much as a swift in the upper sky, nothing but slender filaments or white cloud. No swallows glided over the surface of the water. If there were fishes, he could not see them through the waves, which were here much larger, sufficiently large, though the wind was light, to make his canoe rise and fall with their regular rolling. To see fishes, a calm surface is necessary, and like other creatures, they haunt the shallows and the shore. Never had he felt alone like this in the depths of the farthest forest he had penetrated. Had he contemplated beforehand the possibility of passing out of sight of land, when he found that the time had arrived, he would probably have been alarmed and anxious for his safety. But thus, stumbling drowsily into the solitude of the vast lake, he was so astounded with his own discovery, so absorbed in thinking of the immense expanse, that the idea of danger did not occur to him. Another hour passed, and he now began to gaze about him more eagerly for some sign of land, for he had very little provision with him, and he did not wish to spend the night upon the lake. Presently, however, the mist on the horizon ahead appeared to thicken, and then become blue, and in a shorter time than he expected, land came in sight. This arose from the fact of it being low, so that he had approached nearer than he knew before recognizing it. At the time when he was really out of sight of the coast, he was much farther from the hilly land left behind than from the low country in front, and not in the mathematical centre, as he had supposed, of the lake. As it rose and came more into sight, he already began to wonder what reception he should meet from the inhabitants, and whether he should find them as hard of heart as the people he had just escaped from. Should he, indeed, venture among them at all, or should he remain in the woods till he had observed more of their ways and manners? These questions were being debated in his mind when he perceived that the wind was falling. As the sun went past the meridian, the breeze fell, till in the hottest part of the afternoon, and when he judged that he was not more than 8 miles from the shore, it sank to the merest zephyr, and the waves by degrees diminished. So faint became the breeze in half an hour's time, and so intermittent, that he found it patience wasted even to hold the rudder paddle. The sail hung and was no longer bellied out. As the idle waves rolled under, it flapped against the mast. The heat was now so intolerable, the light reflected from the water increasing the sensation, that he was obliged to make himself some shelter by partly lowering the sail, and hauling the yard athwart the vessel, so that the canvas acted as an awning. Gradually the waves declined in volume, and the gentle breathing of the wind ebbed away, till at last the surface was almost still, and he could feel no perceptible air stirring. Weary of sitting in the narrow boat, he stood up, but he could not stretch himself sufficiently for the change to be of much use. The long summer day, previously so pleasant, now appeared scarcely endurable. Upon the silent water the time lingered, for there was nothing to mark its advance, not so much as a shadow beyond that of his own boat. The waves, having now no crest, went under the canoe without chafing against it or rebounding, so that they were noiseless. No fishes rose to the surface. There was nothing living near except a blue butterfly which settled on the mast, having ventured thus far from land. The vastness of the sky overarching the broad water, the sun and the motionless filaments of cloud gave no repose for his gaze, for they were seemingly still. To the weary glance, motion is repose. The waving bows, the foam-tipped waves, afford positive rest to look at. Such intense stillness as this of the summer sky was oppressive. It was like living in space itself, in the ether above. He welcomed at last the gradual downgrade direction of the sun, for, as the heat decreased, he could work with the paddle. Presently he furled the sail, took his paddle, and set his face for the land. He laboured steadily, but made no apparent progress. The canoe was heavy, and the outrigger, or beam, which was of material use in sailing, was a drawback to paddling. He worked till his arms grew weary, and still the blue land seemed as far off as ever. But by the time the sun began to approach the horizon, his efforts had produced some effect. The shore was visible, and the woods beyond. They were still 5 miles distant, and he was tired. There was little chance of his reaching it before night. He put his paddle down for refreshment and rest, and while he was thus engaged, change took place. A faint puff of air came, a second, and a third. A tiny ripple ran along the surface. Now he recollected that he had heard that the mariners depended a great deal on the morning and the evening, the land and the lake breeze as they worked along the shore. This was the first breath of the land breeze. It freshened after a while, and he reset his sail. An hour or so afterwards he came near the shore. He heard the thrushes singing and the cuckoo calling long before he landed. He did not stay to search about for a creek, but ran the canoe on the strand, which was free of reeds or flags, a sign that the waves often beat furiously there, rolling as they must for so many miles. He hauled the canoe up as high as he could, but presently, when he looked about him, he found that he was on a small and narrow island, with a channel in the rear. Tired as he was, yet anxious for the safety of his canoe, he pushed off again, and paddled round and again beached her, with the island between her and the open lake. Else he feared if a south wind should blow, she might be broken to pieces on the strand before his eyes. It was prudent to take the precaution, but, as it happened, the next day the lake was still. He could see no traces of human occupation upon the island, which was of small extent and nearly bare, and therefore, in the morning, paddled across the channel to the mainland as he thought. But upon exploring the opposite shore, it proved not to be the mainland, but merely another island. Paddling round it, he tried again, but with the same result. He found nothing but island after island, all narrow and bearing nothing except bushes. Observing a channel, which seemed to go straight in among those islets, he resolved to follow it, and did so, resting at noontime the whole morning. As he paddled slowly in, he found the water shallower, and weeds, bulrushes, and reeds became thick, except quite in the centre. After the heat of the midday had gone over, he resumed his voyage, and still found the same islets and banks more or less covered with hawthorn bushes, willow, elder, and alder succeeded to islets fringed round their edges with reeds and reed canary grass. When he grew weary of paddling, he landed and stayed the night. The next day he went on again, and still for hour after hour rowed in and out among those banks and islets, till he began to think he should never find his way out. The farther he penetrated, the more numerous became the waterfowl. Ducks swam among the flags, or rose with a rush and splashing. Coots and moorhens dived and hid in the reeds. The lesser grebe sunk at the sound of the paddle like a stone. A strong northern diver raised a wave as he hurried away under the water, his course marked by the undulation above him. Sedgebirds chirped in the willows. Black-headed buntings sat on the trees and watched him without fear. Bearded titmice were there, clinging to the stalks of the sedges, and long-necked herons rose from the reedy places where they loved to wade. Blue dragonflies darted to and fro, or settled on water plants as if they were flowers. Snakes swam across the channels, vibrating their heads from side to side. Swallows swept over his head. Pike struck from the verge of the thick weeds as he came near. Perch rose for insects as they fell helpless into the water. He noticed that the water, though so thick with reeds, was as clear as that in the open lake. There was no scum such as accumulates in stagnant places. From this he concluded that there must be a current, however slight, perhaps from rivers flowing into this part of the lake. He felt the strongest desire to explore farther till he reached the mainland, but he reflected that mere exploration was not his object. It would never obtain Aurora for him. There were no signs whatever of human habitation, and from reeds and bulrushes, however interesting, nothing could be gained. Reluctantly, therefore, on the third morning, having passed the night on one of the islets, he turned his canoe and paddled southwards towards the lake. He did not for a moment attempt to retrace the channel by which he had entered. It would have been an impossibility. He took advantage of any clear space to push through. It took him as long to get out as it had to get in. It was the afternoon of the fourth day when he at last regained the coast. He rested the remainder of the afternoon, wishing to start fresh in the morning, having determined to follow the line of the shore eastwards, and so gradually to circumnavigate the lake. If he succeeded in nothing else, that at least would be something to relate to Aurora. The morning rose fair and bright, with a south-westerly air rather than a breeze. He sailed before it. It was so light that his progress could not have succeeded more than 3 miles an hour. Hour after hour passed away, and still he followed the line of the shore, now going a short way out to skirt an island, and now nearer in to pass between sandbanks. By noon he was so weary of sitting in the canoe that he ran her ashore and rested a while. It was the very height of the heat of the day when he set forth again, and the wind lighter than in the morning. It had, however, changed a little, and blew now from the west, almost too exactly abaft to suit his craft. He could not make a map while sailing or observe his position accurately, but it appeared to him that the shore trended towards the southeast, so that he was gradually turning an arc. He supposed from this that he must be approaching the eastern end of the lake. The water seemed shallower, to judge from the quantity of weeds. Now and then he caught glimpses between the numerous islands of the open lake, and there too the weeds covered the surface in many places. In an hour or two, the breeze increased considerably, and travelling so much quicker he found it required all his dexterity to steer past the islands and clear the banks upon which he was drifting. Once or twice he grazed the willows that overhung the water, and heard the keel of the canoe drag on the bottom. As much as possible he bore away from the mainland, steering southeast, thinking to find deeper water and to be free of the islets. He succeeded in the first, but the islets were now so numerous that he could not tell where the open lake was. The farther the afternoon advanced, the more the breeze freshened, till occasionally, as it blew between the islands, it struck his mast almost with the force of a gale. Felix welcomed the wind, which would enable him to make great progress before evening. If such favouring breezes would continue, he could circumnavigate the waters in a comparatively short time, and might return to Aurora, so far, at least, successful. Hope filled his heart, and he sang to the wind. The waves could not rise among these islands which intercepted them before they could roll far enough to gather force, so that he had all the advantage of the gale without its risks. Except a light haze all round the horizon, the sky was perfectly clear, and it was pleasant now the strong current of air cooled the sun's heat. As he came round the islands, he constantly met and disturbed parties of wildfowl, mallards, and coots. Sometimes they merely hid in the weeds, sometimes they rose, and when they did so, passed to his rear. 22. Discoveries. This little circumstance of the mallards always flying over him and away behind when flushed presently made Felix speculate on the cause, and he kept a closer watch. He now saw what had indeed been going on for some time, that there was a ceaseless stream of waterfowl, mallards, ducks, coots, moorhens, and lesser grebes coming towards him, swimming to the westward. As they met him, they parted and let him through, or rose and went over. Next he noticed that these small birds on the islands were also travelling in the same direction, that is, against the wind. They did not seem in any haste, but flitted from islet to islet, bush to tree, feeding and gossiping as they went. Still the movement was distinct. Finches, linnets, blackbirds, thrushes, wrens, and whitethroats, and many others all passed him, and he could see the same thing going on to his right and left. Felix became much interested in this migration, all the more singular as it was the nesting time, and hundreds of these birds must have left their nests with eggs or young behind them. Nothing that he could think of offered an adequate explanation. He imagined he saw shoals of fishes going the same way, but the surface of the water being ruffled, and the canoe sailing rapidly, he could not be certain. About an hour after he first observed the migration, the stream of birds ceased suddenly. There were no waterfowls in the water, and no finches in the bushes. They had evidently all passed. Those in the van of the migratory army were no doubt scattered and thinly distributed, so that he had been meeting the flocks a long while before he suspected it. The nearer he approached their centre, the thicker they became, and on getting through that, he found solitude. The weeds were thicker than ever, so that he had constantly to edge away from where he supposed the mainland to lie. But there were no waterfowls and no birds on the islets. Suddenly, as he rounded a large island, he saw what for the moment he imagined to be a line of white surf, but the next instant he recognized a solid mass, as it were, of swallows and martins flying just over the surface of the water, straight towards him. He had no time to notice how far they extended before they had gone by him with a rushing sound. Turning to look back, he saw them continue directly west in the teeth of the wind. Like the water and the islands, the sky was now cleared of birds, and not a swallow remained. Felix asked himself if he was running into some unknown danger, but he could not conceive any. The only thing that occurred to him was the possibility of the wind rising to a hurricane. That gave him no alarm, because the numerous islands would afford shelter. So complete was the shelter in some places that as he passed along, his sail drew above, while the surface of the water, almost surrounded with bushes and willows, was smooth. No matter to how many quarters of the compass the wind might veer, he should still be able to get under the lee of one or other of the banks. The sky remained without clouds. There was nothing but a slight haze, which he sometimes fancied looked thicker in front or to the eastward. There was nothing whatever to cause the least uneasiness. On the contrary, his curiosity was aroused, and he was desirous of discovering what it was that had startled the birds. After a while, the water became rather more open, with sandbanks instead of islands, so that he could see around him for a considerable distance. By a large bank, behind which the ripple was stilled, he saw a low wave advancing towards him and moving against the wind. It was followed by two others at short intervals, and though he could not see them, he had no doubt shoals of fish were passing and had raised the undulations. The sedges on the sandbanks appeared brown and withered, as if it had been autumn instead of early summer. The flags were brown at the tip, and the aquatic grasses had dwindled. They looked as if they could not grow, and had reached but half their natural height. From the low willows the leaves were dropping, faded and yellow, and the thorn bushes were shriveled and covered with the white cocoons of caterpillars. The farther he sailed, the more desolate the banks seemed, and trees ceased altogether. Even the willows were fewer and stunted, and the highest thorn bush was not above his chest. His vessel was now more exposed to the wind, so that he drove past the banks and scattered islands rapidly, and he noticed that there was not so much as a crow on them. Upturned mussel shells glittering in the sunshine showed where crows had been at work, but there was not one now visible. Felix thought the water had lost its clearness and had become thick, which he put down to the action of the wavelets disturbing the sand in the shallows. Ahead, the haze or mist was now much thicker and was apparently not over a mile distant. It hid the islands and concealed everything. He expected to enter it immediately, but it receded as he approached. Along the strand of an island he passed there was a dark line like a stain, and in still water under the lee the surface was covered with floating scum. Felix, on seeing this, at once concluded that he had unknowingly entered a gulf and had left the main lake, for the only place he had ever seen scum before was at the extremity of a creek near home, where the water was partly stagnant on a marshy level. The water of the lake was proverbial for its purity and clearness. He kept, therefore, a sharp lookout, expecting every moment to sight the end of the gulf or creek in which he supposed himself sailing, so that he might be ready to lower his sail. By degrees the wind had risen till it now blew with fury, but the numerous sand flats so broke up the waves that he found no inconvenience from them. One solitary gull passed over at a great height, flying steadily westwards against the wind. The canoe now began to overtake fragments of scum drifting before the wind, and rising up and down on the ripples. Once he saw a broad piece rise to the surface together with a quantity of bubbles. None of the sandbanks now rose more than a foot or so above the surface, and were entirely bare, mere sand and gravel. The mist ahead was sensibly nearer, and yet it eluded him. It was of a faint yellow, and though so thin, obscured everything where it hovered. From out of the mist there presently appeared a vast stretch of weeds. They floated on the surface and undulated to the wavelets, a pale yellowish-green expanse. Felix was hesitating whether to lower his sail or attempt to drive over them, when, as he advanced and the mist retreated, he saw open water beyond. The weeds extended on either hand as far as he could see, but they were only a narrow band, and he hesitated no longer. He felt the canoe graze the bottom once as he sailed over the weeds. The water was free of sandbanks beyond them, but he could see large islands looming in several directions. Glancing behind him, he perceived that the faint yellow mist had closed in, and now encircled him. It came within 200 or 300 yards, and was not affected by the wind, rough as it was. Quite suddenly, he noticed that the water on which the canoe floated was black. The wavelets which rolled alongside were black, and the slight spray that occasionally flew on board was black and stained the side of the vessel. This greatly astonished and almost shocked him. It was so opposite and contrary to all his ideas about the lake, the very mirror of purity. He leant over and dipped up a little in the palm of his hand. It did not appear black in such a small quantity. It seemed a rusty brown, and he became aware of an offensive odour. The odour clung to his hand, and he could not remove it, to his great disgust. It was nothing he had ever smelt before, and not in the least like the vapour of marshes. By now, being some distance from any island, the wavelets increased in size, and spray flew on board, wetting everything with the black liquid. Instead of the level marches at the end of the gulf, it appeared as if the water were deep, and also as if it widened. Exposed to the full press of the gale, Felix began to fear that he should not be able to return very easily against it. He did not know what to do. The horrid blackness of the water disposed him to turn about and tack out. On the other hand, having set out on a voyage of discovery, and having now found something different to the other parts of the lake, he did not like to retreat. He sailed on, thinking to presently pass these loathsome waters. He was now hungry, and indeed thirsty, but was unable to drink because he had no water barrel. No vessel sailing on the lake ever carried a water barrel, since such pure water was always under their bows. He was cramped, too, with long sitting in the canoe, and the sun was perceptibly sloping in the west. He determined to land and rest, and with this purpose steered to the right under the lee of a large island. So large, indeed, that he was not certain it was not part of the mainland or one side of the gulf. The water was deep close up to the shore, but, to his annoyance, the strand appeared black, as if soaked with the dark water. He skirted along somewhat farther, and found a ledge of low rocks stretching out into the lake, so that he was obliged to run ashore before coming to these. On landing, the black strand, to his relief, was fairly firm, for he had dreaded sinking to the knees in it, but its appearance was so unpleasant that he could not bring himself to sit down. He walked on towards the ledge of rocks, thinking to find a pleasanter place there. They were stratified, and he stepped on them to climb up when his foot went deep into the apparently hard rock. He kicked it, and his shoe penetrated it as if it had been soft sand. It was impossible to climb up the reef. The ground rose inland, and curious to see around him as far as possible, he ascended the slope. From the summit, however, he could not see farther than on the shore, for the pale yellow mist rose up round him and hid the canoe on the strand. The extreme desolation of the dark and barren ground repelled him. There was not a tree, bush, or living creature, not so much as a buzzing fly. He turned to go down, and then for the first time noticed that the disk of the sun was surrounded with a faint blue rim, apparently caused by the yellow vapour. So much were the rays shorn of their glare that he could look at the sun without any distress, but its heat seemed to have increased, though it was now late in the afternoon. Descending towards the canoe, he fancied the wind had veered considerably. He sat down in the boat and took some food. It was without relish, as he had nothing to drink, and the great heat had tired him. Wearily, and without thinking, he pushed off the canoe. She slowly floated out when, as he was about to hoist up the sail, a tremendous gust of wind struck him down on the thwarts and nearly carried him overboard. He caught the mast as he fell, or over he must have gone into the black waves. Before he could recover himself, she drifted against the ledge of the rocks, which broke down and sank before the blow, so that she passed over uninjured. Felix got out a paddle and directed the canoe as well as he could. The fury of the wind was irresistible, and he could only drive before it. In a few minutes, as he was swept along the shore, he was carried between it and another immense reef. Here, the waves being broken and less powerful, he contrived to get the heavy canoe ashore again, and jumping out, dragged her up as far as he could on the land. When he had done this, he found to his surprise that the gale had ceased. The tremendous burst of wind had been succeeded by a perfect calm, and the waves had already lost their violent impetus. This was a relief, for he had feared that the canoe would be utterly broken to pieces, but soon he began to doubt if it were an unmixed benefit, as without a wind he could not move from this dismal place that evening. He was too weary to paddle far. He sat on the canoe to rest himself, and whether from fatigue or other causes, fell asleep. His head, heavily drooping on his chest, partly woke him several times, but his lassitude overcame the discomfort, and he slept on. When he got up, he felt dazed and unrefreshed, as if sleeping had been hard work. He was extremely thirsty and oppressed with the increasing heat. The sun had sunk, or rather was so low that the high ground hid it from sight. 23. Strange things. The thought struck Felix that perhaps he might find a spring somewhere in the island, and he started at once up over the hill. At the top he paused. The sun had not sunk, but had disappeared as a disk. In its place was a billow of blood, for so it looked, a vast upheaved billow of glowing blood surging on the horizon. Over it flickered a tint of palest blue, like that seen in fire. The black waters reflected the glow, and the yellow vapour around was suffused with it. Though momentarily startled, Felix did not much heed these appearances. He was still dazed and heavy from his sleep. He went on, looking for a spring, sometimes walking on firm ground, sometimes sinking to the ankle in a friable soil like black sand. The ground looked indeed as if it had been burnt, but there was no charred stumps of timber such as he had seen on the sites of the forest fires. The extreme dreariness seemed to oppress his spirits, and he went on and on in a heavy waking dream. Descending into a plain, he lost sight of the flaming sunset and the black waters. In the level plain, the desolation was yet more marked. There was not a grass blade or plant. The surface was hard, black and burned, resembling iron, and indeed, in places, it resounded to his feet, though he supposed that was the echo from hollow passages beneath. Several times he shook himself, straightening himself up, and endeavoured to throw off the sense of drowsy weight which increased upon him. He could not do so. He walked with bent back and crept, as it were, over the iron land which radiated heat. A shimmer, like that of water, appeared in front. He quickened his pace, but could not get to it, and he realized presently that it was a mirage, which receded as he advanced. There was no pleasant summer twilight. The sunset succeeded by an indefinite gloom, and while this shadow hung overhead, the yellow vapour around was faintly radiant. Felix suddenly stopped, having stepped, as he thought, on a skeleton. Another glance, however, showed that it was merely the impression of one. The actual bones had long since disappeared. The ribs, the skull, and limbs were drawn on the black ground in white lines, as if it had been done with a broad piece of chalk. Close by, he found 3 or 4 more, intertangled and superimposed, as if the unhappy beings had fallen partly across each other, and in that position had mouldered away, leaving nothing but their outline. From among a variety of objects that were scattered about, Felix picked up something that shone. It was a diamond bracelet of 1 large stone, and a small square of blue china tile, with a curious heraldic animal drawn on it. Evidently, these had belonged to one or other of the party who had perished. Though startled at the first sight, it was curious that Felix felt so little horror. The idea did not occur to him that he was in danger as these had been. Inhaling the gaseous emanations from the soil, and contained in the yellow vapour, he had become narcotized, and moved as if under the influence of opium, while wide awake and capable of rational conduct. His senses were deadened, and did not carry the usual vivid impressions to the mind. He saw things as if they were afar off. Accidentally looking back, he found that his footmarks, as far as he could see, shone with a phosphoric light like that of touchwood in the dark. Near at hand they did not shine. The appearance did not come till some minutes had elapsed. His track was visible behind till the vapour hid it. As the evening drew on, the vapour became more luminous and somewhat resembled an aurora. Still anxious for water, he proceeded as straight ahead as he could, and shortly became conscious of an indefinite cloud which kept pace with him on either side. When he turned to look at either of the clouds, the one looked at disappeared. It was not considered enough to be visible to direct vision, yet he was aware of it from the corner of his eye. Shapeless and threatening, the gloomy thickness of the air floated beside him like the vague monster of a dream. Sometimes he fancied that he saw an arm or a limb among the folds of the cloud, or an approach to a face. The instant he looked, it vanished. Marching at each hand, these vapours bore him horrible company. His brain became unsteady, and flickering things moved about him, yet, though alarmed, he was not afraid. His senses were not acute enough for fear. The heat increased. His hands were intolerably hot, as if he had been in a fever. He panted, but he did not perspire. A dry heat, like an oven, burned his blood in his veins. His head felt enlarged, and his eyes seemed alight. He could see these 2 globes of phosphoric light under his brows. They seemed to stand out so that he could see them. He thought his path straight. It was really curved, nor did he know that he staggered as he walked. Presently, a white object appeared ahead, and on coming to it he found it was a wall, white as snow with some kind of crystal. He touched it, when the wall fell immediately with a crushing sound, as if pulverized, and disappeared in a vast cavern at his feet. Beyond this chasm, he came to more walls like those of houses, such as would be left if the roofs fell in. He carefully avoided touching them, for they seemed as brittle as glass, and merely a white powder having no consistency at all. As he advanced, these remnants of buildings increased in number, so that he had to wind in and out and round them. In some places, the crystallized wall had fallen of itself, and he could see down into the cavern, for the house had either been built partly underground, or, which was more probable, the ground had risen. Whether the walls had been of brick or stone or other material, he could not tell. They were now like salt. Soon wearying of winding round these walls, Felix returned and retraced his steps till he was outside the place, and then went on towards the left. Not long after, as he still walked in a dream and without feeling his feet, he descended a slight slope and found the ground change in colour from black to a dull red. In his dazed state, he had taken several steps out into this red before he noticed that it was liquid, unctuous, and slimy, like a thick oil. It deepened rapidly and was already over his shoes. He returned to the black shore and stood looking out over the water, if such it could be called. The luminous yellow vapour had now risen a height of 10 or 15 feet, and formed a roof both over the land and over the red water, under which it was possible to see for a great distance. The surface of the red oil, or viscid liquid, was perfectly smooth, and indeed it did not seem as if any wind could rouse a wave on it, much less that a swell should be left after the gale had gone down. Disappointed in his search for water to drink, Felix mechanically turned to go back. He followed his luminous footmarks, which he could see a long way before him. His trail curved so much that he had made many short cuts across the winding line he had left. His weariness was now so intense that all feeling had departed. His feet, his limbs, his arms and hands were numbed. The subtle poison of the emanations from the earth had begun to deaden his nerves. It seemed a full hour or more to him till he reached the spot where the skeletons were drawn in white upon the ground. He passed a few yards to one side of them, and stumbled over a heap of something which he did not observe, as it was black like the level ground. It emitted a metallic sound, and looking he saw that he had kicked his foot against a great heap of money. The coins were black as ink. He picked up a handful and went on. Hitherto Felix had accepted all that he saw as something so strange as to be unaccountable. During his advance into this region in the canoe, he had in fact become slowly stupefied by the poisonous vapour he had inhaled. His mind was partly in abeyance. It acted, but only after some time had elapsed. He now at last began to realize his position. The finding of the heap of blackened money touched a chord of memory. These skeletons were the miserable relics of men who had ventured, in search of ancient treasures, into the deadly marshes over the site of the mightiest city of former days. The deserted and utterly extinct city of London was under his feet. He had penetrated into the midst of that dreadful place, of which he had heard many a tradition, how the earth was poison, the water poison, the air poison, the very light of heaven falling through such an atmosphere. Poison. There were said to be places where the earth was on fire, and belched forth sulphurous fumes, supposed to be from the combustion of the enormous stores of strange and unknown chemicals collected by the wonderful people of those times. Upon the surface of the water there was a greenish-yellow oil, to touch which was death to any creature. It was the very essence of corruption. Sometimes it floated before the wind, and fragments became attached to reeds or flags far from the place itself. If a moorhen or duck chanced to rub the reed, and but one drop stuck to its feathers, it forthwith died. Of the red waters he had not heard, nor of the black into which he had unwittingly sailed. Ghastly beings haunted the site of so many crimes, shapeless monsters hovering by night and weaving a fearful dance. Frequently they caught fire, as it seemed, and burned as they flew or floated in the air. Remembering these stories, which in part at least seemed now to be true, Felix glanced aside, where the clouds still kept pace with him, and involuntarily put his hands to his ears, lest the darkness of the air should whisper some horror of old times. The earth on which he walked, the black earth, leaving phosphoric footprints behind him, was composed of the mouldered bodies of millions of men who had passed away in the centuries during which the city existed. He shuddered as he moved. He hastened, yet could not go fast. His numbed limbs would not permit him. He dreaded lest he should fall and sleep, and wake no more, like the searchers after treasure which they had found only to lose for ever. He looked around, supposing that he might see the gleaming head and shoulders of the half-buried giant, of which he recollected he had been told. The giant was punished for some crime by being buried to the chest in the earth. Fire incessantly consumed his head and played about it, yet it was not destroyed. The learned thought, if such a thing really existed, that it must be the upper part of an ancient brazen statue, kept bright by the action of acid in the atmosphere, and shining with reflected light. Felix did not see it, and shortly afterwards mounted the hill, and looked down upon his canoe. It was on fire. 24. Fiery vapours. Felix tried to run, but his feet would not rise from the ground. His limbs were numb as in a nightmare. He could not get there. His body would not obey his will. In reality, he did move, but more slowly than when he walked. By degrees approaching the canoe, his alarm subsided, for although it burned, it was not injured. The canvas of the sail was not even scorched. When he got to it, the flames had disappeared, like jack-o'-the-lanterns. The phosphoric fire receded from him. With all his strength, he strove to launch her, yet paused, for over the surface of the black water, now smooth and waveless, played immense curling flames, stretching out like endless serpents, weaving, winding, rolling over each other. Suddenly they contracted into a ball which shone with a steady light, and was as large as the full moon. The ball swept along, rose a little, and from it flew out long streamers, till it was unwound in fiery threads. But remembering that the flames had not even scorched the canvas, he pushed the canoe afloat, determined at any risk to leave this dreadful place. To his joy, he felt a faint air rising. It cooled his forehead, but was not enough to fill the sail. He paddled with all the strength he had left. The air seemed to come from exactly the opposite direction to what it had previously blown. Some point of east, he supposed. Labour as hard as he would, the canoe moved slowly, being so heavy. It seemed as if the black water was thick and clung to her, retarding motion. Still, he did move, and in time, it seemed indeed a time, he left the island, which disappeared in the luminous vapours. Uncertain as to the direction, he got his compass, but it would not act. The needle had no life. It swung and came to rest, pointing any way as it chanced. It was demagnetized. Felix resolved to trust the wind, which he was certain blew from the opposite quarter, and would therefore carry him out. The stars he could not see for the vapour, which formed a roof above him. The wind was rising, but in uncertain gusts. However, he hoisted the sail and floated slowly before it. Nothing but excitement could have kept him awake. Reclining in the canoe, he watched the serpent-like flames playing over the surface, and forced himself by sheer power of will not to sleep. The 2 dark clouds which had accompanied him to the shore now faded away, and the cooling wind enabled him to bear up better against his parching thirst. His hope was to reach the clear and beautiful lake. His dread that in the uncertain light he might strike a concealed sandbank and become firmly fixed. Twice he passed islands, distinguishable as masses of visible darkness, while the twisted flames played up to the shore and the luminous vapour overhung the ground. The island itself appeared as a black mass. The wind became by degrees steadier, and the canoe shot swiftly over the water. His hopes rose. He sat up and kept a keener lookout ahead. All at once the canoe shook as if she had struck a rock. She vibrated from one end to the other, and stopped for a moment in her course. Felix sprang up alarmed. At the same instant a bellowing noise reached him, succeeded by a frightful belching and roaring, as if a volcano had burst forth under the surface of the water. He looked back, but could see nothing. The canoe had not touched ground. She sailed as rapidly as before. Again the shock, and again the hideous roaring, as if some force beneath the water was forcing itself up, vast bubbles rising and bursting. Fortunately, it was at a great distance. Hardly was it silent before it was reiterated for the 3rd time. Next, Felix felt the canoe heave up, and he was aware that a large roller had passed under him. A second, and a third followed. They were without crests and were not raised by the wind. They obviously started from the scene of the disturbance. Soon afterwards, the canoe moved quicker, and he detected a strong current setting in the direction he was sailing. The noise did not reoccur, nor did any more rollers pass under. Felix felt better and less dazed, but his weariness and sleepiness increased every moment. He fancied that the serpent flames were less brilliant or farther apart, and that the luminous vapour was thinner. How long he sat at the rudder he could not tell. He noticed that it seemed to grow darker. The serpent flames faded away, and the luminous vapour was succeeded by something like the natural gloom of night. At last he saw a star overhead, and hailed it with joy. He thought of Aurora. The next instant he fell back in the canoe, firm asleep. His arm, however, still retained the rudder paddle in position, so that the canoe sped on with equal swiftness. She would have struck more than one of the sandbanks and islets had it not been for the strong current that was running. Instead of carrying her against the banks, this warded her off, for it drew her between the islets in the channels, where it ran fastest, and the undertow, where it struck the shore, bore her back from the land. Driving before the wind, the canoe swept onward, steadily to the west. In an hour it had passed the line of the black water, and entered the sweet lake. Another hour, and all traces of the marshes had utterly disappeared. The last faint glow of the vapour had vanished. The dawn of the coming summer's day appeared, and the sky became a lovely azure. The canoe sailed on, but Felix remained immovable in slumber. Long since the strong current had ceased. It scarcely extended into the sweet waters, and the wind only impelled the canoe. As the sun rose, the breeze gradually fell away, and in an hour or so there was only a light air. The canoe had left most of the islets and was approaching the open lake, when, as she passed, almost the last, the yard caught the overhanging branch of a willow. The canoe swung round and grounded gently under the shadow of the tree. For some time the little wavelets beat against the side of the boat. Gradually they ceased, and the clear and beautiful water became still. Felix slept till nearly noon, when he awoke and sat up. At the sudden movement, a pike struck, and 2 more hens scuttled out of the water into the grass on the shore. A thrush was singing sweetly. Whitethroats were busy in the bushes, and swallows swept by overhead. Felix drew a long, deep breath of intense relief. It was like a waking in paradise. He snatched up a cup, dipped and satisfied his craving thirst, then washed his hands over the side and threw the water over his face. But when he came to stand up and move, he found that his limbs were almost powerless. Like a child he tottered. His joints had no strength. His legs tingled as if they had been benumbed. He was so weak he crawled on all fours along to the mast, furled the sail kneeling, and dragged himself rather than stepped ashore with the painter. The instant he had fastened the rope to a branch, he threw himself at full length on the grass, and grasped a handful of it. Merely to touch the grass after such an experience was intense delight. The song of the thrush, the chatter of the whitethroats, the sight of a hedge-sparrow gave him inexpressible pleasure. Lying on the sward, he watched the curves traced by the swallows in the sky. From the sedges came the curious cry of the moorhen. A bright kingfisher went by. He rested as he had never rested before. His whole body, his whole being was resigned to rest. It was fully 2 hours before he rose and crept on all fours into the canoe for food. There was only sufficient left for 1 meal, but that gave him no concerns now he was out of the marshes. He could fish and use his crossbow. He now observed what had escaped him during the night. The canoe was black from end to end. Stem, stern, gunwale, thwart, outrigger, mast, and sail were black. The stain did not come off on being touched. It seemed burnt in. As he leaned over the side to dip water and saw his reflection, he started. His face was black, his clothes were black, his hair black. In his eagerness to drink the first time, he had noticed nothing. His hands were less dark. Contact with the paddle and ropes had partly rubbed it off, he supposed. He washed, but the water did not materially diminish the discoloration. After eating, he returned to the grass and rested again, and it was not till the sun was sinking that he felt any return of vigour. Still weak, but able now to walk, leaning on a stick, he began to make a camp for the coming night. But a few scraps, the remnant of his former meal, were left. On these he supped after a fashion, and long before the white owl began his rounds, Felix was fast asleep on his hunter's hide from the canoe. He found next morning that the island was small, only a few acres. It was well wooded, dry, and sandy in places. He had little inclination or strength to resume his expedition. He erected a booth of branches and resolved to stay a few days till his strength returned. By shooting wildfowl and fishing he fared very well, and soon recovered. In 2 days the discoloration of the skin had faded to an olive tint, which too grew fainter. The canoe lost its blackness and became a rusty colour. By rubbing the coins he had carried away, he found they were gold. Part of the inscription remained, but he could not read it. The blue china tile was less injured than the metal. After washing it, It was bright, but the diamond pleased him most. It would be a splendid present for Aurora. Never had he seen anything like it in the palaces. He believed it was twice the size of the largest possessed by any king or prince. It was as big as his fingernail, and shone and gleamed in the sunlight, sparkling and reflecting the beams. Its value must be very great. But well he knew how dangerous it would be to exhibit it on some pretext or other. He would be thrown into prison, and the gem seized. It must be hidden with the greatest care till he could produce it in Thyma Castle, when the Baron would protect it. Felix regretted now that he had not searched further. Perhaps he might have found other treasures for Aurora. The next instant he repudiated his greed, and was only thankful that he had escaped with his life. He wondered and marvelled that he had done so. It was so well known that almost all who had ventured in had perished. Reflecting on the circumstances which had accompanied his entrance to the marshes, the migration of the birds seemed almost the most singular. They were evidently flying from some apprehended danger, and that most probably would be in the air. The gale at that time, however, was blowing in a direction which would appear to ensure safety to them, into and not out of the poisonous marshes. Did they then foresee that it would change? Did they expect it to veer like a cyclone and presently blow east with the same vigour as it then blew west? That would carry the vapour from the inky waters out over the sweet lake, and might even cause the foul water itself to temporarily encroach on the sweet. The more he thought of it, the more he felt convinced that this was the explanation, and as a fact, the wind, after dropping, did rise again and blow from the east, though, as it happened, not with nearly the same strength. It fell, too, before long, fortunately for him. Clearing the birds had anticipated a cyclone, and that the wind, turning, would carry the gases out upon them to their destruction. They had therefore hurried away, and the fishes had done the same. The velocity of the gale, which had carried him into the black waters, had proved his safety by driving before it the thicker and most poisonous portion of the vapour, compressing it towards the east, so that he had entered the dreaded precincts under favourable conditions. When it dropped while he was on the Black Island, he soon began to feel the effect of the gases rising imperceptibly from the soil, and had he not had the good fortune to escape so soon, no doubt he would have fallen a victim. He could not congratulate himself sufficiently upon his good fortune. The other circumstances appeared to be due to the decay of the ancient city, to the decomposition of accumulated matter, to phosphorescence and gaseous exhalations. The black rocks that crumbled at a touch were doubtless the remains of ancient buildings, saturated with the dark water and vapours. Inland, similar remains were white and resembled salt. But the great explosions which occurred as he was leaving, and which sent heavy rollers after him, were not easily understood till he remembered that in Sylvester's Book of Natural Things it was related that the ancient city had been undermined with vast conduits, sewers, and tunnels, and that these communicated with the sea. It had been much disputed whether the sea did or did not still send its tides up to the site of the old quays. Felix now thought that the explosions were due to compressed air, or more probably to gases met with by the ascending tide. 25. The Shepherds. For 4 days Felix remained on the island, recovering his strength. By degrees the memory of the scenes he had witnessed grew less vivid, and his nerves regained their tone. The 5th morning he sailed again, making due south with a gentle breeze from the west, which suited the canoe very well. He considered that he was now at the eastern extremity of the lake, and that by sailing south he should presently research the place where the shore turned to the west again. The sharp prow of the canoe cut swiftly through the waves. A light spray flew occasionally in his face, and the wind blew pleasantly. In the cloudless sky swallows and swifts were wheeling, and on the water 6 mallards moved aside to let him pass. About 2 hours after he started, he encountered a mist which came softly over the surface of the water with the wind, and in an instant shut out all view. Even the sun was scarcely visible. It was very warm and left no moisture. In 5 minutes he passed through and emerged again in the bright sunlight. These dry, warm mists are frequently seen on the lake in summer, and are believed to portend a continuance of fine weather. Felix kept a good distance from the mainland, which was hilly and wooded, and with few islands. Presently he observed in the extreme distance on his right hand a line of mountainous hills which he supposed to be the southern shore of the lake, and that he was sailing into a gulf or bay. He debated with himself whether he should alter his course and work across to the mountains, or continue to trace the shore. Unless he did trace the shore, he could scarcely say that he had circumnavigated the lake, as he would leave this great bay unexplored. He continued, therefore, to sail directly south. The wind freshened towards noon, and the canoe flew at a great pace. Twice he passed through similar mists. There were now no islands at all, but a line of low chalk cliffs marked the shore. Considering that it must be deep and safe to do so, Felix bore in closer to look at the land. Woods ran along the hills right to the verge of the cliff, but he saw no signs of inhabitants, no smoke, boat, or house. The sound of the surf beating on the beach was audible, though the waves were not large. Over the cliff he noticed a kite soaring, with forked tail, at a great height. Immediately afterwards he ran into another mist or vapour, thicker, if anything, and which quite obscured his view. It seemed like a great cloud on the surface of the water, and broader than those he had previously entered. Suddenly the canoe stopped with a tremendous jerk, which pitched him forward on his knees. The mast cracked, and there was a noise of splitting wood. As soon as he could get up, Felix saw to his bitter sorrow that the canoe had split longitudinally. The water came through the split, and the boat was held together only by the beams of the outrigger. He had run aground on a large ship, flint embedded in a chalk floor, which had split the poplar wood of the canoe like an axe. The voyage was over, for the least strain would cause the canoe to part in two, and if she were washed off the ground, she would be waterlogged. In half a minute the mist passed, leaving him in the bright day, shipwrecked. Felix now saw that the waters were white with suspended chalk, and sounding with the paddle, found that the depth was but a few inches. He had driven at full speed on a reef. There was no danger, for the distance to the shore was hardly 200 yards, and judging by the appearance of the water, it was shallow all the way. But his canoe, the product of so much labour, and in which he had voyaged so far, his canoe was destroyed. He could not repair her. He doubted whether it could have been done successfully even at home, with Oliver to help him. He could sail no farther. There was nothing for it but to get ashore and travel on foot. If the wind rose higher, the waves would soon break clean over her, and she would go to pieces. With a heavy heart, Felix took his paddle and stepped overboard. Feeling with the paddle, he plumbed the depth in front of him, and, as he expected, walked all the way to the shore, no deeper than his knees. This was fortunate, as it enabled him to convey his things to land without loss. He wrapped up the tools and manuscripts in one of his hunter's hides. When the whole cargo was landed, he sat down sorrowfully at the foot of the cliff and looked out at the broken mast and sail, still flapping uselessly in the breeze. It was a long time before he recovered himself and set to work mechanically to bury the crossbow, hunter's hides, tools, and manuscripts under a heap of pebbles. As the cliff, though low, was perpendicular, he could not scale it, else he would have preferred to conceal them in the woods above. To pile pebbles over them was the best he could do for the present. He intended to return for them when he discovered a path up the cliff. He then started, taking only his bow and arrows. But no such path was to be found. He walked on and on till weary, and still the cliff ran like a wall on his left hand. After an hour's rest, he started again, and, as the sun was declining, came suddenly to a gap in the cliff, where a grassy sward came down to the shore. It was now too late, and he was too weary to think of returning for his things that evening. He made a scanty meal and endeavoured to rest, but the excitement of losing the canoe, the long march since, the lack of good food, all tended to render him restless. Weary, he could not rest, nor move farther. The time passed slowly. The sun sank, the wind ceased. After an interminable time, the stars appeared, and still he could not sleep. He had chosen a spot under an oak on the green slope. The night was warm and even sultry, so that he did not miss his covering. But there was no rest in him. Towards the dawn, which comes very early at that season, he at last slept with his back to the tree. He awoke with a start in broad daylight to see a man standing in front of him, armed with a long spear. Felix sprang to his feet, instinctively feeling for his hunting knife, but he saw in an instant that no injury was meant, for the man was leaning on the shaft of his weapon, and, of course, could, if so he had wished, had run him through while sleeping. They looked at each other for a moment. The stranger was clad in a tunic and wore a hat of plaited straw. He was very tall and strongly built, his single weapon a spear of twice his own length. His beard came down on his chest. He spoke to Felix in a dialect the latter did not understand. Felix held out his hand as a token of amity, which the other took. He spoke again. Felix, on his part, tried to explain his shipwreck, when a word the stranger uttered recalled to Felix's memory the peculiar dialect used by the shepherd race on the hills in the neighbourhood of his home. He spoke in this dialect, which the stranger in part at least understood, and the sound of which at once rendered him more friendly. By degrees they comprehended each other's meaning the easier, as the shepherd had come the same way, and had seen the wreck of the canoe. Felix learned that the shepherd was a scout sent on ahead to see that the road was clear of enemies. His tribe were on the march with their flocks, and to avoid the steep woods and hills which there blocked their course, they had followed the level and open beach at the foot of the cliff, aware, of course, of the gap which Felix had found. While they were talking, Felix saw the cloud of dust raised by the sheep as the flocks wound round a jutting buttress of cliff. His friend explained that they marched in the night and early morning to avoid the heat of the day. Their proposed halting place was close at hand. He must go on and see that all was clear. Felix accompanied him, and found within the wood at the summit a grassy coombe where a spring rose. The shepherd threw down his spear and began to dam up the channel of the spring with stones, flints, and sods of earth, in order to form a pool at which the sheep might drink. Felix assisted him, and the water speedily began to rise. The flocks were not allowed to rush tumultuously to the water. They came in about 50 at a time, each division with its shepherds and their dogs, so that confusion was avoided and all had their share. There were about 20 of these divisions, besides 80 cows and a few goats. They had no horses, Their baggage came on the backs of asses. After the whole of the flocks and herds had been watered, several fires were lit by the women, who in stature and hardihood scarcely differed from the men. Not till this work was over did the others gather about Felix to hear his story. Finding that he was hungry, they ran to the baggage for food, and pressed on him a little dark bread, plentiful cheese and butter, dried tongue, and horns of mead. He could not devour a 50th part of what these hospitable people brought him. Having nothing else to give them, he took from his pocket one of the gold coins he had brought from the site of the ancient city, and offered it. They laughed, and made him understand that it was of no value to them, but they passed it from hand to hand, and he noticed that they began to look at him curiously. From its blackened appearance they conjectured whence he had obtained it. One, too, pointed to his shoes, which were still blackened, and appeared to have been scorched. The whole camp now pressed on him, their wonder and interest rising to a great height. With some trouble Felix described his journey over the site of the ancient city, interrupted with constant exclamations, questions, and excited conversation. He told them everything, except about the diamond. Their manner towards him perceptibly altered. From the first they had been hospitable. They now became respectful, and even reverent. The elders and their chief, not to be distinguished by dress or ornament from the rest, treated him with ceremony and marked deference. The children were brought to see and even to touch him. So great was their amazement that anyone should have escaped from these pestilential vapours that they attributed it to divine interposition, and looked upon him with some of the awe of superstition. He was asked to stay with them altogether, and to take command of the tribe. The latter Felix declined. To stay with them for a while, at least, he was, of course, willing enough. He mentioned his hidden possessions, and got up to return for them, but they would not permit him. 2 men started at once. He gave them the bearings of the spot, and they had not the least doubt but that they should find it, especially as the wind being still, the canoe would not yet have broken up, and would guide them. The tribe remained in the green coombe the whole day, resting from their long journey. They wearied Felix with questions. Still, he answered them as copiously as he could. He felt too grateful for their kindness not to satisfy them. His bow was handled, his arrows carried so that the quiver for the first time was empty, and the arrows scattered in 20 hands. He astonished them by exhibiting his skill with the weapon, striking a tree with an arrow at nearly 300 yards. Though familiar, of course, with the bow, they had never seen shooting like that, nor, indeed, any archery except at short quarters. They had no other arms themselves but spears and knives. Seeing one of the women cutting the boughs from a fallen tree, dead and dry, and therefore preferable for fuel, Felix naturally went to help her, and taking the axe, soon made a bundle, which he carried for her. It was his duty as a noble to see that no woman, not a slave, laboured. He had been bred in that idea, and would have felt disgraced had he permitted it. The woman looked on with astonishment, for in these rude tribes the labour of the woman was considered valuable and appraised like that of a horse. Without any conscious design, Felix thus in one day conciliated and won the regard of the 2 most powerful parties in the camp, the chief and the women. By his refusing the command, the chief was flattered, and his possible hostility prevented. The act of cutting the wood and carrying the bundle gave him the hearts of the women. They did not, indeed, think that their labour in any degree oppressive. Still, to be relieved of it was pleasing. The 2 men who had gone for Felix's buried treasure did not return till breakfast next morning. They stepped into the camp, each with his spear reddened and dripping with fresh blood. Felix no sooner saw the blood than he fainted. He quickly recovered, but he could not endure the sight of the spears which were removed and hidden from his view. He had seen blood enough spilt at the siege of Iwas, but this came upon him in all its horror, unrelieved by the excitement of war. The two shepherds had been dogged by gypsies and had been obliged to make a round to escape. They took their revenge by climbing into trees, and as their pursuers passed under, thrust them through with their long spears. The shepherds, like all their related tribes, had been at feud with the gypsies for many generations. The gypsies followed them to and from their pastures, cut off stragglers, destroyed or stole their sheep and cattle, and now and then overwhelmed a whole tribe. Of late the contests had become more sanguinary and almost ceaseless. Mounted on swift, though small horses, the gypsies had the advantage of the shepherds. On the other hand, the shepherds, being men of great stature and strength, could not be carried away by a rush if they had time to form a circle, as was their custom of battle. They lost many men by the javelins thrown by the gypsies, who rode up to the edge of the circle, cast their darts, and retreated. If the shepherds left their circle, they were easily ridden over. While they maintained formation, they lost individuals, but saved the mass. Battles were of rare occurrence. The gypsies watched for opportunities and executed raids. The shepherds retaliated, and thus the endless war continued. The shepherds invariably posted sentinels and sent forward scouts to ascertain if the way were clear. Accustomed to the horrid scenes of war from childhood, they could not understand Felix's sensitiveness. They laughed and then petted him like a spoilt child. This galled him exceedingly. He felt humiliated and eager to reassert his manhood. He was willing to stay with them before, for a while. Nothing would have induced him to leave them now, till he had vindicated himself in their sight. The incident happened soon after sunrise, which is very early at the end of June. The camp had only waited for the return of these men, and on their appearance began to move. The march that morning was not a long one, as the sky was clear, and the heat soon wearied the flocks. Felix accompanied the scout in advance, armed with his bow, eager to encounter the gypsies. 26. Bow and arrow. 3 mornings the shepherds marched in the same manner, when they came in view of a range of hills, so high that to Felix they appeared mountains. The home of the tribe was in these hills, and once there they were comparatively safe from attack. In early spring, when the herbage on the downs was scarce, the flocks moved to the meadow-like lands far in the valleys. In summer they returned to the hills. In autumn they went to the vales again. Soon after noon on the 3rd day, the scouts reported that a large body of gypsies were moving in a direction which would cut off their course to the hills on the morrow. The chief held a council, and it was determined that a forced march should be made at once by another route, more to the left, and it was thought that in this way they might reach the base of the slope by evening. The distance was not great and could easily have been traversed by the men. The flocks and herds, however, could not be hurried much. A messenger was dispatched to the hills for assistance, and the march began. It was a tedious movement. Felix was wearied and walked in a drowsy state. Towards 6 o'clock, as he guessed, the trees began to thin, and the column reached the first slopes of the hills. Here about 30 shepherds joined them, a contingent from the nearest camp. It was considered that the danger was now past, and that the gypsies would not attack them on the hill, but it was a mistake. A large body almost immediately appeared, coming along the slope on the right, not less than 200, and from their opening movements and numbers, it was evident that they intended battle. The flocks and herds were driven hastily into a coombe or narrow valley, and there left to their fate. All the armed men formed in a circle. The women occupied the centre. Felix took his stand outside the circle by a gnarled and decayed oak. There was just there a slight rise in the ground, which he knew would give him some advantage in discharging his arrows, and would also allow him a clear view. His friends earnestly entreated him to enter the circle, and even sought to bring him in within it by force, till he explained to them that he could not shoot if surrounded, and promised if the gypsies charged to rush inside. Felix unslung his quiver, and placed it on the ground before him. A second quiver he put beside it. 4 or 5 arrows he stuck upright in the sward, so that he could catch hold of them quickly. 2 arrows he held in his left hand, another he fitted to the string. Thus prepared, he watched the gypsies advance. They came walking their short, wiry horses to within half a mile, when they began to trot down the slope. They could not surround the shepherds because of the steep-sided coombe and some brushwood, and could advance only on 2 fronts. Felix rapidly became so excited that his sight was affected, and his head whirled. His heart beat with such a speed that his breath seemed going. His limbs tottered, and he dreaded lest he should faint. His intensely nervous organisation, strung up to its highest pitch, shook him in its grasp, and his will was powerless to control it. He felt that he should disgrace himself once more before these rugged but brave shepherds, who betrayed not the slightest symptom of agitation. For 1 hour of Oliver's calm courage and utter absence of nervousness he would have given years of his life. His friends in the circle observed his agitation, and renewed their entreaties to him to come inside it. This only was needed to complete his discomfiture. He had lost his head altogether. He saw nothing but a confused mass of yellow and red rushing towards him. For each of the gypsies wore a yellow or red scarf, some about the body, some over the shoulder, others round the head. They were now within 300 yards. A murmur from the shepherd's spearman. Felix had discharged an arrow. It stuck in the ground about 20 paces from him. He shot again. It flew wild and quivering, and dropped harmlessly. Another murmur. They expressed to each other their contempt for the bow. This immediately restored Felix. He forgot the enemy as an enemy. He forgot himself. He thought only of his skill as an archer, now in question. Pride upheld him. The 3rd arrow he fitted properly to the string. He planted his left foot slightly in advance, and looked steadfastly at the horseman before he drew his bow. At a distance of 150 yards, they had paused, and were widening out so as to advance in loose open rank, and allow each man to throw his javelin. They shouted. The spearmen in the circle replied, and levelled their spears. Felix fixed his eye on one of the gypsies who was ordering and marshalling the rest, a chief. He drew the arrow swiftly but quietly. The string hummed. The pliant yew obeyed, and the long arrow shot forward in a steady, swift flight, like a line of gossamer drawn through the air. It missed the chief, but pierced the horse. He rode just in front of the rider's thigh. The maddened horse reared and fell backwards on his rider. The spearmen shouted. Before the sound could leave their lips, another arrow had sped. A gypsy threw up his arms with a shriek. The arrow had gone through his body. A 3rd, a 4th, a 5th, 6 gypsies rolled on the sward. Shout upon shout rent the air from the spearmen. Utterly unused to this mode of fighting, the gypsies fell back. Still the fatal arrows pursued them, and ere they were out of range 3 others fell. Now the rage of battle burned in Felix. His eyes gleamed. His lips were open, and his nostrils were wide like a horse running a race. He shouted to the spearmen to follow him, and snatching up his quiver ran forward. Gathered together in a group, the gypsy band consulted. Felix ran at full speed, swift of foot. He left the heavy spearmen behind. Alone he approached the horsemen. All the Aquila courage was up within him. He kept the higher ground as he ran, and stopped suddenly on a little knoll of tumulus. His arrow flew. A gypsy fell. Again, and a third. Their anger gave them fresh courage, to be repulsed by one only. 20 of them started to charge and run him down. The keen arrows flew faster than their horses' feet. Now the horse, and now the man, met these sharp points. 6 fell, and the rest returned. The shepherds came running. Felix ordered them to charge the gypsies. His success gave him authority. They obeyed, and as they charged, he shot 9 more arrows, 9 more deadly wounds. Suddenly, the gypsy band turned and fled into the brushwood on the lower slopes. Breathless, Felix sat down on the knoll, and the spearmen swarmed around him. Hardly had they begun to speak to him than there was a shout, and they saw a body of shepherds descending the hill. There were 300 of them, warned by the messenger. The whole country had risen to repel the gypsies. Too late to join in the fight, they had seen the last of it. They examined the field. There were 10 dead and 6 wounded, who were taken prisoners. The rest escaped, though hurt. In many cases, the arrows had gone clean through the body. Then, for the first time, they understood the immense power of the yew-bow in strong and skilful hands. Felix was overwhelmed. They almost crushed him with their attentions. The women fell at his feet and kissed him, but the archer could scarcely reply. His intense nervous excitement had left him weak and almost faint. His one idea was to rest. As he walked back to the camp between the chiefs of the shepherd spearmen, his eyes closed, his limbs tottered, and they had to support him. At the camp he threw himself on the sward under the gnarled oak, and was instantly fast asleep. Immediately the camp was stilled, not to disturb him. His adventures in the marshes of the buried city, his canoe, his archery, were talked of the livelong night. Next morning, the camp set out for their home in the mountains, and he was escorted by nearly 400 spearmen. They had saved for him the ornaments of the gypsies who had fallen, golden earrings and nose rings. He gave them to the women, except one, a finger ring, set with turquoise and evidently of ancient make, which he kept for Aurora. 2 marches brought them to the home of the tribe, where the rest of the spearmen left them. The place was called Wolfstead. Felix saw at once how easily this spot might be fortified. There was a deep and narrow valley like a groove or green trench opening to the south. At the upper end of the valley rose a hill, not very high, but steep, narrow at the ridge, and steep again on the other side. Over it was a broad, wooded, and beautiful vale. Beyond that again, the higher mountains. Towards the foot of the narrow ridge here, there was a succession of chalk cliffs, so that to climb upon that side in the face of opposition would be extremely difficult. In the gorge of the enclosed narrow valley, a spring rose. The shepherds had formed 8 pools, one after the other, water being of great importance to them, and farther down, where the valley opened, there were 40 or 50 acres of irrigated meadow. The spring then ran into a considerable brook, across which was the forest. Felix's idea was to run a palisade along the margin of the brook, and up both sides of the valley to the ridge. There he would build a fort. The edges of the chalk cliffs he would connect with a palisade or a wall, and so form a complete enclosure. He mentioned his scheme to the shepherds. They did not greatly care for it, as they had always been secure without it, the rugged nature of the country not permitting horsemen to penetrate. But they were so completely under his influence that to please him they set about the work. He had to show them how to make a palisade. They had never seen one, and he made the first part of it himself. At building a wall with loose stones without mortar, the shepherds were skilful. The wall along the verge of the cliffs was soon up, and so was the fort on the top of the ridge. The fort consisted merely of a circular wall, breast high, with embrasures or crenellations. When this was finished, Felix had a sense of mastership, for in this fort he felt as if he could rule the whole country. From day to day, shepherds came from the more distant parts to see the famous archer and to admire the enclosure. Though the idea of it never occurred to him, now they saw it, they fully understood its advantages, and 2 other chiefs began to erect similar forts and palisades. 27. Surprised. Felix was now anxious to continue his journey, yet he did not like to leave the shepherds with whom his life was so pleasant. As usual, when deliberating, he wandered about the hills, and thus into the forest. The shepherds at first insisted on at least 2 of their number accompanying him. They were fearful lest the gypsies should seize him, or a bushman assassinate him. This company was irksome to Felix. In time he convinced them that he was a much better hunter than any of the tribe, and they permitted him to roam alone. During one of these excursions into the forest, he discovered a beautiful lake. He looked down on the water from the summit of one of the green mountains. It was, he thought, 1/2 mile across, and the opposite shore was open woodland, grassy and meadow-like, and dotted with fine old oaks. By degrees these closed together, and the forest succeeded. Beyond it again, and at a distance of 2 miles, were green hills. A little clearing only was wanted to make the place fit for a castle and enclosure. Through the grassland opposite, he traced the course of a large brook down to the lake. Another entered it on the right, and the lake gradually narrowed to a river on his left. Could he erect a tower there and bring Aurora to it? How happy he would be! A more beautiful spot he had never seen, nor one more suited for every purpose of life. He followed the course of the stream, which left the lake, every now and then disturbing wild goats from the cliffs, and twice he saw deer under the oaks across it. On rounding a spur of down, he saw that the river debouched into a much wider lake, which he conjectured must be the Sweet Waters. He went on till he reached the mouth of the river, and had then no doubt that he was standing once more on the shore of the Sweet Water Sea. On this, the southern side, the banks were low. On the other, a steep chalky cliff almost overhung the river, and jutted out into the lake, curving somewhat towards him. A fort on that cliff would command the entrance to the river. The cliff was a natural breakwater, so that there was a haven at its base. The river appeared broad and deep enough for navigation, so that vessels could pass from the great lake to the inland water, about 6 or 7 miles, he supposed. Felix was much taken with this spot. The beauty of the inland lake, the evident richness of the soil, the river communicating with the great lake, the cliff commanding its entrance. Never, in all his wanderings, had he seen a district so well suited for a settlement and the founding of a city. If he had but 1,000 men, how soon he would bring Aurora there, and build a tower, and erect a palisade. So occupied was he with the thought that he returned the whole distance to the spot where he had made the discovery. There he remained a long time, designing it all in his mind. The tower he would build yonder, 3/4 of a mile, perhaps a mile, inland from the opposite shore, on a green knoll at the base which the brook flowed. It would be even more pleasant there than on the shore of the lake. The forest he would clear back a little and put up a stout palisade, enclosing at least 3 miles of grassy land. By the shore of the lake he would build his own town, so that his vessels might be able to go forth into the great sweet water sea. So strongly did imagination hold him that he did not observe how near it was to sunset, nor did he remark the threatening aspect of the sky. Thunder awoke him from his dream. He looked and saw a storm rapidly coming from the northeast. He descended the hill and sheltered himself as well as possible among some thick fir trees. After the lightning, the rain poured so heavily that it penetrated the branches, and he unstrung his bow and placed the string in his pocket that it might not become wet. Instantly there was a whoop on either side, and 2 gypsies darted from the undergrowth towards him. While this terrible bow was bent, they had followed him, tracking his footsteps. The moment he unstrung the bow, they rushed out. Felix crushed through between the firs, by main force getting through, but only opening a passage for them to follow. They could easily have thrust their darts through him, but their object was to take him alive, and to gratify the revenge of the tribes with torture. Felix doubled from the firs, and made towards the far distant camp, but he was faced by 3 more gypsies. He turned again and made for the steep hill he had descended. With all his strength he raced up it. His lightness of foot carried him in advance, and he reached the summit 100 yards ahead. But he knew he must be overtaken presently, unless he could hit upon some stratagem. In the instant that he paused to breathe on the summit, a thought struck him. Like the wind, he raced along the ridge, making for the great sweet water, the same path he had followed in the morning. Once on the ridge, the 5 pursuers shouted. They knew they should have him now. There were no more hills to breast. It was not so easy as they imagined. Felix was in splendid training. He kept his head and even drew a little on them. Still, he knew in time he must succumb, just as the stag, though swifter of foot, ultimately succumbs to the hounds. They would track him till they had him. If only he could gain enough to have time to string and bend his bow. But with all his efforts, he could not get away more than 100 yards, and that was not far enough. It could be traversed in 10 seconds. They would have him before he could string it and fit an arrow. If only he had been fresh as in the morning. But he had had a long walk during the day, and not much food. He knew that his burst of speed must soon slacken. But he had a stratagem yet. Keeping along the ridge till he reached the place where the lake narrowed to the river, suddenly he rushed down the hill towards the water. The edge was encumbered with brushwood and fallen trees. He scrambled over and through anyhow. He tore a path through the bushes and plunged in. But his jacket caught in a branch. He had his knife out and cut off the shred of cloth. Then, with the bow and knife in one hand, he struck out for the opposite shore. His hope was that the gypsies, being horsemen and passing all their lives on their horses, might not know how to swim. His conjecture was right. They stopped on the brink and yelled their loudest. When he had passed the middle of the slow stream, their rage rose to a shriek, startling a heron far down the water. Felix reached the opposite shore in safety, but the bowstring was now wet and useless. He struck off at once, straight across the grasslands, past the oaks he had admired, past the green knoll where in imagination he had built his castle, and brought Aurora through the brook, which he found was larger than it appeared at a distance, and required 2 or 3 strokes to cross. A few more paces, and the forest sheltered him. Under the trees he rested, and considered what course to pursue. The gypsies would expect him to endeavour to regain his friends, and would watch to cut off his return. Felix determined to make instead for another camp farther east, and to get even there by a detour. Bitterly he reproached himself for his folly in leaving the camp, knowing that gypsies were about with no other weapon than the bow. The knife at his belt was practically no weapon at all, useful only in the last extremity. Had he had a short sword or javelin, he would have faced the two gypsies who first sprang towards him. Worse than this was the folly of wandering without the last precaution into a territory at that time full of gypsies, who had every reason to desire his capture. If he had used the ordinary precautions of woodcraft, he would have noticed their traces, and he would not have exposed himself in full view on the ridges of the hills, where a man was visible for miles. If he perished through his carelessness, how bitter it would be. To lose Aurora by the merest folly would indeed be humiliating. He braced himself to the journey before him, and set off at a good swinging hunter's pace, as it is called. That is, a pace rather more than a walk, and less than a run, with the limbs somewhat bent and long, springy steps. The forest was in the worst possible condition for movement. The rain had dampened the fern and undergrowth, and every branch showered raindrops upon him. It was now past sunset, and the dusk was increasing. This he welcomed as hiding him. He travelled on till nearly dawn, and then, turning to the right, swept round and regained the line of the mountainous hills after sunrise. There he rested, and reached a camp about 9 in the morning, having walked altogether since the preceding morning fully 50 miles. This camp was about 15 miles from that of his friends. The shepherds knew him, and one of them started with the news of his safety. In the afternoon, 10 of his friends came over to see him, and to reproach him. His weariness was so great that for 3 days he scarcely moved from the hut, during which time the weather was wet and stormy, as is often the case in summer after a thunderstorm. On the 4th morning it was fine, and Felix, now quite restored to his usual strength, went out with the shepherds. He found some of them engaged in throwing up a heap of stones, flint, and chalk lumps near an oak tree in a plain at the foot of the hill. They told him that during the thunderstorm 2 cows and 10 sheep had been killed there by lightning, which had scarcely injured the oak. It was their custom to pile up a heap of stones wherever such an event occurred, to warn others from staying themselves or allowing their sheep or cattle to stay near the spot in thunder, as it was observed that where lightning struck once, it was sure to strike again, sooner or later. "Then," said Felix, "you may be sure that there is water there." He knew from his study of the knowledge of the ancients that lightning frequently leaped from trees or buildings to concealed water, but he had no intention of indicating water in that particular spot. He meant the remark in a general sense. But the shepherds, ever desirous of water, and looking on Felix as a being of a different order to themselves, took his casual observation in its literal sense. They brought their tools and dug, and, as it chanced, found a copious spring. The water gushed forth and formed a streamlet. Upon this the whole tribe gathered, and they saluted Felix as one almost divine. It was in vain that he endeavoured to repel this homage and to explain the reason of his remark, and that it was only in a general way that he intended it. Facts were too strong for him. They had heard his words, which they considered an inspiration, and there was the water. It was no use. There was the spring, the very thing they most wanted. Perforce Felix was invested with attributes beyond nature. The report spread. His own friends came in a crowd to see the new spring. Others journeyed from afar. In a week, Felix having meanwhile returned to Wolfstead, his fame had for the 2nd time spread all over the district. Some came 100 miles to see him. Nothing he could say was listened to. These simple, straightforward people understood nothing but facts, and the defeat of the gypsies and discovery of the spring seemed to them little less than supernatural. Besides which, In innumerable little ways, Felix's superior knowledge had told upon them. His very manners spoke of high training, his persuasive voice won them. His constructive skill and power of planning, as shown in the palisades and enclosure, showed a grasp of circumstances new to them. This was a man such as they had never before seen. They began to bring him disputes to settle. He shrank from this position of judge, but it was useless to struggle. They would wait as long as he liked, but his decision they would have, and no other. Next came the sick begging to be cured. Here Felix was firm. He would not attempt to be a physician, and they went away. But, unfortunately, it happened that he let out his knowledge of plants, and back they came. Felix did not know what course to pursue. If by chance he did anyone any good, crowds would beset him. If injury resulted, perhaps he would be assassinated. This fear was quite unfounded. He really had not the smallest idea how high he stood in their estimation. After much consideration, Felix hit upon a method which would save him from many inconveniences. He announced his intention of forming a herb garden in which to grow the best kind of herbs, and at the same time he would not administer any medicine himself, but would tell their own native physicians and nurses all he knew so that they could use his knowledge. The herb garden was at once begun in the valley. It could not contain much till next year, and meantime, if any diseased persons came, Felix saw them, expressed his opinion to the old shepherd, who was the doctor of the tribe, and the latter carried out his instructions. Felix did succeed in relieving some small ailments, and thereby added to his reputation. 28. For Aurora. Felix now began to find out for himself the ancient truth, that difficulties always confront man. Success only changes them and increases their number. Difficulties faced him in every direction. At home it had seemed impossible for him to do anything. Now that success seemed to smile on him, and he had become a power, instead of everything being smooth and easy, new difficulties sprang up for solution at every point. He wished to continue his journey, but he feared that he would not be permitted to depart. He would have to start anyway in the night, in which case he could hardly return to them again, and yet he wished to return to these, the first friends he had had, and amongst whom he hoped to found a city. Another week slipped away, and Felix was meditating his escape when one afternoon a deputation of 10 spearmen arrived from a distant tribe, who had nominated him their king and sent their principal men to convey the intelligence. Fame is always greatest at a distance, and this tribe in the mountains of the east had actually chosen him as king, and declared that they would obey him whether he took up his residence with them or not. Felix was naturally greatly pleased. How delighted Aurora would be! But he was in perplexity what to do, for he could not tell whether the Wolfstead people would be favourably inclined or would resent his selection. He had not long to consider. There was an assembly of the tribe, and they too chose him by common consent as their king. Secretly, they were annoyed that the other tribe had been more forward than themselves, and were anxious that Felix should not leave them. Felix declined the honour. In spite of his refusal, he was treated as if he were the most despotic monarch. 4 days afterwards, 2 other tribes joined the movement, and sent their acceptance of him as their monarch. Others followed, and so quickly now that a day never passed without another tribe sending a deputation. Felix thought deeply on the matter. He was, of course, flattered and ready to accept the dignity, but he was alive to consideration of policy. He resolved that he would not use the title, nor exercise the functions of a king as usually understood. He explained his plan to the chiefs. It was that he should be called simply leader, the leader of the war, that he should only assume royal authority in time of war. that the present chiefs should retain their authority and each govern as before, in accordance with ancient custom. He proposed to be king only during wartime. He would, if they liked, write out their laws for them in a book, and so give their customs cohesion and shape. To this plan the tribes readily agreed. It retained all the former customs, it left the chiefs their simple patriarchal authority, and it gave all of them the advantage of combination in war. As the leader, Felix was henceforth known. In the course of a fortnight, upwards of 6,000 men had joined the confederacy, and Felix wrote down the names of 20 tribes on a sheet of parchment, which he took from his chest. A hut had long since been built for him, but he received all the deputations and held the assemblies which were necessary in the circular fort. He was so pressed to visit the tribes that he could not refuse to go to the nearest, and thus his journey was again postponed. During this progress from tribal camp to tribal camp, Felix gained the adhesion of 12 more, making a total of 32 names of camps representing about 8,000 spearmen. With pride, Felix reflected that he commanded a far larger army than the Prince of Pons, but he was not happy. Months had now elapsed since he had parted from Aurora. There were no means of communicating with her. A letter could be conveyed only by a special messenger. He could not get a messenger, and even if one had been forthcoming, he could not instruct him how to reach Thyma Castle. He did not know himself. The country was entirely unexplored, except that the direction was west. He had no knowledge whatever. He had often inquired of the shepherds, but they were perfectly ignorant. Anchor's Gate was the most westerly of all their settlements, which chiefly extended eastwards. Beyond Anchor's Gate was the trackless forest, of which none but the bushmen knew anything. They did not understand what he meant by a map. All they could tell him was that the range of mountains, hills continued westerly and southerly for an unascertained distance, and that the country was uninhabited except by wandering gypsy tribes. South was the sea, the salt water, but they never went down to it, or near it, because there was no sustenance for their flocks and herds. Till now, Felix did not know that he was near the sea. He resolved at once to visit it. As nearly as he could discover, the great freshwater lake did not reach any farther south. Wolfstead was not far from its southern margin. He concluded, therefore, that the shore of the lake must run continually westward, and that if he followed it, he should ultimately reach the very creek from which he had started in the canoe. How far it was, he could not reckon. There were none of the shepherds who could be sent with a letter. They were not hunters and were unused to woodcraft. There was not one capable of the journey. Unless he went himself, he could not communicate with Aurora. 2 routes were open to him, one straight, through the forest on foot, the other by water, which latter entailed the construction of another canoe. Journey by water, too, he had found was subject to unforeseen risks. Till he could train some of the younger men to row a galley, he decided not to attempt the voyage. There was but the forest route left, and that he resolved to attempt. But when? And how, without offending his friends? Meantime, while he revolved the subject in his mind, he visited the river and the shore, or the great lake, this time accompanied by 10 spears. The second visit only increased his admiration of the place, and his desire to take possession of it. He ascended a tall larch, from whose boughs he had a view out over the lake. The shore seemed to go almost directly west. There were no islands and no land in sight. The water was open and clear. Next day he started for the sea. He wished to see it for its own sake, and secondly because if he could trace the trend of the shore, he would perhaps be able to put together a mental map of the country, and so assure himself of the right route to pursue when he started for Thyma Castle. His guides took him directly south, and in 3 marches, 3 days, brought him to the strand. This journey was not in a straight line. They considered it was about 30 or 40 miles to sea, but the country was covered with almost impenetrable forests, which compelled a circuitous path. They had also to avoid a great ridge of hills, and to slip through a pass or river valley, because these hills were frequently traversed by the gypsies, who were said indeed to travel along them for hundreds of miles. Through the river valley, therefore, which wound between the hills, they approached the sea, so much on a level with it that Felix did not catch a distant glimpse. In the afternoon of the third day, they heard a low murmur, and soon afterwards came out from the forest itself upon a wide bed of shingle, bordered with scattered bushes on the inland side. Climbing over this, Felix saw the green line of the sea rise and extend itself on either hand. In the glory of the scene, he forgot his anxieties and his hopes. They fell from him together, leaving the mind alone with itself and love. For the memory of Aurora rendered the beauty before him still more beautiful. Love, like the sunshine, threw a glamour over the waves. His old and highest thoughts returned to him in all their strength. He must follow them. He could not help himself. Standing where the foam came nearly to his feet, the resolution to pursue his aspirations took possession of him, as strong as the sea. When he turned from it, he said to himself, "This is the first step homewards to her. This is the first step of my renewed labour." To fulfil his love and his ambition was one and the same thing. He must see her, and then again endeavour with all his abilities to make himself a position which she could share. Towards the evening, leaving his escort, he partly ascended the nearest slope of the hills to ascertain more perfectly than was possible at a lower level the direction in which the shore trended. It was nearly east and west, and as the shore of the inland lake ran west, it appeared that between them there was a broad belt of forest. Through this he must pass, and he thought if he continued due west, he should cross an imaginary line drawn south from his own home through Thyma Castle. Then, by turning to the north, he should presently reach that settlement. But when he should cross this line, how many days' travelling it would need to reach it was a matter of conjecture, and he must be guided by circumstances, the appearance of the country, and his hunter's instinct. On the way back to Wolfstead, Felix was occupied in considering how he could leave his friends, and yet be able to return to them and resume his position. His general idea was to build a fortified house or castle at the spot which had so pleased him, and to bring Aurora to it. He could then devote himself to increasing and consolidating his rule over these people, and perhaps in time organize a kingdom. But without Aurora, the time it would require would be unendurable. By some means he must bring her. The whole day long as he walked he thought and thought, trying to discover some means by which he could accomplish these things. Yet the more he considered, the more difficult they appeared to him. There seemed no plan that promised success. All he could do would be to risk the attempt. By 2 days after returning from the sea, it chanced towards the afternoon he fell asleep, and on waking found his mind full of ideas, which he felt sure would succeed if anything would. The question had solved itself during sleep. The mind, like a wearied lamb, strained by too much effort, had recovered its elasticity and freshness, and he saw clearly what he ought to do. He convened an assembly of the chief men of the nearest tribes, and addressed them in the circular fort. He asked them if they could place sufficient confidence in him to assist him in carrying out certain plans, although he should not be able to altogether disclose the object he had in view. They replied as one man that they had perfect confidence in him, and would implicitly obey. He then said that the first thing he wished was the clearing of the land by the river, in order that he might erect a fortified dwelling suitable to his position as their leader in war. Next, he desired their permission to leave them for 2 months, at the end of which he would return. He could not, at that time, explain his reasons, but until this journey had been made, he could not finally settle among them. To this announcement they listened in profound silence. It was evident that they disliked his leaving them, yet did not wish to seem distrustful by expressing this feeling. Thirdly, he continued, he wanted them to clear a path through the forest, commencing at Anchor's Gate, and proceeding exactly west. The track to be 30 yards wide, in order that the undergrowth might not encroach upon it, and to be carried on straight to the westward until his return. The distance to which the path was cleared he should take as the measure of their loyalty to him. They immediately promised to fulfil this desire, but added that there was no necessity to wait till he left them. It should be commenced the very next morning. To his reiterated request for leave of absence, they preserved an ominous silence, and, as he had no more to say, the assembly then broke up. It was afternoon, and Felix, as he watched the departing chiefs, reflected that these men would certainly set a watch upon him to prevent his escape. Without another moment's delay, he entered his hut, and took from their hiding-place the diamond bracelet, the turquoise ring, and other presents for Aurora. He also secured some provisions, and put 2 spare bowstrings in his pocket. His bow, of course, he carried. Telling the people about that he was going to the next settlement, Bedston, and was anxious to overtake the chief from that place who had attended the assembly, he started. So soon as he knew he could not be seen from the settlement, he quitted the trail, and made a wide circuit till he faced westwards. Anchor's Gate was a small outlying post, the most westerly from Wolfstead. He went near it to get a true direction, but not sufficiently near to be observed. This was on the 4th of September. The sun was declining as he finally left the country of his friends, and entered the immense forest which lay between him and Aurora. Not only was there no track, but no one had ever traversed it, unless indeed it were bushmen who, to all intents, might be confused with the wild animals which it contained. Yet his heart rose as he walked rapidly among the oaks. Already he saw her. He felt the welcoming touch of her hand. The danger of bushman or gypsy was as nothing. The forest at the commencement consisted chiefly of oaks, trees which do not grow close together, and so permitted of quick walking. Felix pushed on, absorbed in thought. The sun sank, still onward, and as the dusk fell, he was still moving rapidly westwards.